Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the final budget for the 2012 budget cycle, the final budget hearing for the Fairfield Board of Finance. Would everybody please rise? I'm going to ask the Chief Fiscal Officer, Paul Hiller, and Linda Gardner, the Budget Director, to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. The state of play for tonight in terms of the budget is the first vote we will take will be for the Board of Education budget. Second, we will do the compensation packages, compensation for the first selectman, the two selectmen, and the town clerk. And we need to set those compensation packages for the next 4 years, the totality of their terms. And then we will go department by department through the town budget. The process we'll go through is I will ask for motions, entertain any motions. We'll first vote on the motions, and then we'll vote on that department budget. At the end, we will vote on the budget as a whole for the town, and then Mr. Hiller will summarize the results. Before that, though, I did want to take one last moment in the beginning of the meeting to recognize the hard work of several people. We tend to leave this till the end, which could be at 11 o'clock at night, and there's not too many people around at that point. And I think it's very important that we recognize the efforts. We as a board want to thank the first selectman and all of his department heads for their preparation and their presentations throughout this process. We also want to thank Dr. Teitel and his administrators for their efforts and their work in putting the budget together. We want to especially thank Paul Hiller, Bonnie McQuain, and Linda Gardner, who are responsible for the day-to-day management of the budget process and put in untold hours in preparation. I also want to wish Bonnie good luck and best wishes in her retirement, and once again thank her for her service to the town, the Board of Education, and all the children of the town. We especially want to thank the Town Facilities Commission. They were thrown into the midst of this budget process. We're given a very tight timeline and difficult deliverables, but they got it done, and we appreciate their effort as well as their expertise in helping us to come to better and more informed decisions. Also, an unsung hero for our board is Deb Garavel, who has the painful duty of sitting through all of our meetings, having to transcribe them into legible minutes. She also does have the pleasant duty, however, of beating me up, trying to keep me on time, and helping us to keep the railroad on the tracks. So thank you very much. The Board of Finance would also like to extend its appreciation and admiration for our colleagues on the Board of Selectmen. We appreciate you being good partners in this budget process, for being prepared, for actively participating, and for working with us to reach the best decisions possible for the town. Lastly, and personally, I would like to thank the members of the Board of Finance. I'm fortunate to receive some nice emails and comments regarding our meetings. Their professionalism, their depth, their thoughtfulness, and the facts that we treat each other with respect. I always respond the same way. I'm very fortunate to have 8 great colleagues who make my job easy. We don't always agree with one another, but very rarely are we disagreeable. As I've said before, I'm proud to be among them and thank them for their time, their energy, their stamina, their good humor, and their dedication to doing what they believe is best for the town. So thank you all. Thank everyone for being involved in the process. And we would also like to thank the people of Fairfield who have called us, emailed us, attended our meetings, and been very thoughtful in their comments for the entire town. So thank you. With that, if nobody else has any comments they would like to make, I will. Yes, Mr. DeWitt.
I would like to thank Mr. Flynn for his leadership and his direction of we 9. That is often a tough thing to corral often. and the respect that you show all of us all the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. DeWitt. That's very
Here,
kind.
here. I think we all second that.
Thank you. With that in mind, let's turn to the budget before us. And in appreciation of our audience, let's do the Board of Education first. So, if we can go to that budget and realize that the, what page is that on in the budget book, if someone might help me real quick? Page 241. All right. So the request was originally $148,505,841. That was the approved budget by the Board of Education. Standing before us is a budget approved by the Board of Selectmen at $146,480,350, which is a total of a $2 million cut to that budget. Is that correct? Do I have the numbers correct? Yes. Okay. Questions, comments, or motions on this budget? Mr. Bolito?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just as a procedural point, I know in years past what we've done is have a designated member of the board do the first and a designated member do the second to expedite the process as far as the motions go. So if you want to do that at this time?
Absolutely. Can we have a first, Mr. Bolito, can that be you?
Sure, happy to.
Can we have a second? Mr. Tetro, that can be you. Thank you very much, I appreciate it. Do you have any comments on the budget, questions, or amendments to this budget? Anyone? Seeing nothing, do I have a motion on this budget? Mr.
Yes.
Bolito? Mr. Tetro? Okay, the budget is now before us as approved by the Board of Selectmen. All in favor? Opposed? Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, we have 8 in favor, 1 abstention, or 1 opposed, and no abstentions. Okay, so the Board of Education budget is passed as was referred by the Board of Selectmen. Let's go to the next budget. The next budget would be page 33, the Board of Selectmen. Or actually, before we start that, thank you, we need to do the compensation for the first selectman, the Board of Selectmen, and the town clerk. I distributed to the board members.
Mr. Chair?
Yes,
Just,
Mr. Tetra.
I think at this point, I'm going to follow Mr. Walsh's lead and recuse myself from this discussion.
Thank
And
you,
I'll
Mr.
join you back after it's over.
Thank you, Mr. Tetra. Do we have others?
Yes, I will recuse myself as well, Mr. Chairman.
As will I, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, we would have 3 members that would recuse themselves from this. And as they're filing out of the room, I want to thank as well the Board of Education. Did a fine job on their budget. Yeah. What did he say? Okay. All right. So we're now down to a more manageable number of 6.
We get done until they come back.
Yeah.
Things could really go smoothly with 6.
Right. All right. Before us now is the matter of setting the compensation for the first selectman, and we'll deal with that first, and the Board of Selectmen. And then we'll deal with the town clerk. I think we can let our colleagues back in for the town clerk spot. I distributed a letter that I received today, or Mr. Hiller distributed a letter that he received today from the town attorney that was put together at my request. And Mr. Hiller, I hope there's copies of those available for the public. Let me explain the situation like this. There were questions by board members relative to the first selectman and the role of this board in setting his quote-unquote compensation, his or hers compensation. We have to realize we're talking about a position and not an individual. The question was, is compensation just salary, or does compensation imply their entire benefits package, including pension and medical insurance? A very specific question with a somewhat murky response. Not only was the response not clear in the letter in some regards, it also calls into question the way the town's been managing it for any number of years regarding who actually sets the compensation package. And that is because, and I don't think the town attorneys, either of the town attorneys are present. We did ask them if they would try to be here, but it was late in the day when we made the request. But the letter seems to imply that, and Mr. Flato just walked in, thank you, sir. The letter seems to imply that the compensation for the first selectman is set by the Board of Selectmen and then authorized through the budget process by us and then ratified by the RTM. At least that's the way I read it. Mr. Hiller, would you concur with that?
Through Mr. Saxel and Ms. Cannelli's letter, I would, yes.
Right. And it talks about, very specifically in the first selectman, it talks about compensation. So it says, "We find no authority under state statute for the town charter and the town code which would give such power to the Board of Finance. In fact, there's a prohibition, against relating to pension benefits, as Article 37 of the Town Code requires that all full-time town employees, other than members of the police and fire department, be members of the pension plan established under that ordinance. Although the pension plan can be modified by union contracts and supersedes local town ordinance, the town charter, the Board of Finance has no authority to unilaterally require that the first selectman or the town clerk participate in a defined contribution plan in lieu of existing defined benefit plan." And it goes on to talk about the role of the town, of the Board of Finance is limited to setting the salary for the town clerk and recommending the salary of the first selectman, which in turn must be approved by the RTM in the budget process. But in looking at the charter, it very specifically for the first selectman says compensation. It very specifically for the town clerk says salary. Right? Further says that the first selectman's salary shall be started by the Board of Selectmen. But the Board of Selectmen never take a vote on the first selectman's salary, other than when they approve the overall budget. Right, Mr. Hiller? Now, past practice has been this board has specifically approved the first selectman's salary, hasn't looked at its other comp, right? But we-
Past practice has been that this board would set it, and then it would be ratified through the budget process, or it could be lowered potentially by action of the RTM.
Right. But so it appears that we have a kind of a murky situation as to the definition of compensation, as to what role the Board of Selectmen should play, as to what role the Board of Finance should play, and as to, ultimately, it ends with the RTM. Correct?
I think the one thing that, as you say, gets to the murky part, there seems to be, first off, some split between the role this board plays with regards to the first selectman and the town clerk. So there's.
Well, the town clerk is very clearly defined that we set his or her salary,
Correct.
and it says that.
And I think the one thing that, at least past history or practice, has been, and this goes back for many years in my position currently and prior to that in tenure that I served on this board, the salary of all the four officials that you had in question had been established initially by this board and then again to be ratified by the RTM.
But it's never ratified by the RTM other than in the course of the budget. They never vote on it independently. Is that correct? I just want to make sure I have the facts straight. That is true. Okay. I see Mr. Flatos here.
Hi. I did, first of all, I know an hour or two ago, the chair asked me if I could try to get
Yeah.
Ms. Kennelly to the meeting, and I did try to reach her. I was unable to. Unfortunately, I left 2 messages. Maybe she'll still get here, but she had already left when I called. But I can shed light on a few things. One is that when I chatted with I guess it was Dick Saxel earlier in the day, He said to me that when Eileen referenced Amendment 19 of the state statute, she said, the way she phrased it was that in the state law, compensation is specifically defined as salary exclusive of other things. And she put that wording in here. So that's not a discretionary item, at least according to her interpretation of it. So whether our charter said compensation or salary doesn't much matter, because pursuant to state statute, it's defined as salary. So I think that's probably why over the years this board has set salary. My hope and guess is, and the only one I could think of that we might be able to see how far back this goes, but my guess would be that at some point in the well past, that the selectmen may have asked the Board of Finance to take the action of setting salaries to make some differentiation in structure with the checks and balances of government, because, just as the first selectman shouldn't set his own salary, for the board, a board that the first selectman chairs to set a salary would also have that potential tension. So I'd love to try to find the history out and see if we can find someone with the, longevity that might know when it started, but my hope and suggestion to the board would be, it would seem to me the way the Board of Finance has operated in setting the salaries in the past has never been challenged. It's been past practice, which under collective bargaining, past practice is a very important precept. And it often in lawsuits takes precedence. Even if a contract says X, if past practice has a variance to that, the courts will often uphold the past practice as the pattern set by a municipality. So my belief and hope is that because the practice has been that the Board of Finance has set the salary for the first selectman, the clerk, the other two selectmen, and the registrars, that it would be my advice that you keep doing that, at least while we research this, to see if there's anything wrong with that. If the RTM cut a budget line, potentially that affects salary, but the RTM has never voted on specific salaries. And neither has, to my knowledge, the Board of Selectmen, at least in the last 20 or so years. And Paul's certainly been involved for 20-plus years. But we will try to find out, from people like Mr. Leahy, who go back to the 70s in longevity of serving the town, as to whether we can get a history of when that process started with the Board of Finance taking these steps. I just think it's worked pretty well. I do. My own personal opinion is I absolutely understand why benefits and such other compensation is set often by the chief executive for all employees, because it affects collective bargaining, and bargaining under state statute is solely the province of the chief executive with ratification for the RTM. The bargaining benefits for first selectman, as far as I know, have always been that the first selectman has followed the benefits offered to town department heads, which primarily mirror the mid-management contract. Now, there are a few things different than that, but, for example, there's some additional life insurance benefits. There's slightly different contribution to health insurance.
And Mr. Flato, who sets that?
That has always been set for decades by the first selectman.
Okay.
And there are
So the-
policies
so the
in
first
writing
selectman
go back
sets-
30 years.
Right, so, and I'm not,
Yeah.
please, take it.
No,
in
I'm
the
just
spirit
saying
of
that's the
tough,
way it
right.
works. I mean-
So, because that's different than many organizations where the CEO gets to define their own benefits outside of salary. I mean, typically, what happens is you have a board or you have an outside group that negotiates for the CEO. Then the CEO takes care of all the other employees under the auspices of their title for their organization.
Maybe because the CEO in Fairfield hasn't gotten separate benefits from other department managers.
Right.
That maybe there was no need. But I'll give you an example. I mean, there's in the school district, there are 2 or 3 people that get, annuities, or in the
Right.
past got them. I suppose theoretically, if things were like that were to be considered, you're right, it wouldn't be such a good thing for chief executive of the town to say, I'm going to give myself a bonus. I mean, that would probably
Right.
not, besides the political ramifications, it certainly would not, I would think, be too kosher. So that's the best I can tell you, but I would hope that the past practice of this, my own hope is that this board would be able to set, at least for the salary side, set those decisions, and if an RTM wished to say, well, we want to take a different look at that, I suppose they could look into it, but it seems to have served the town well over the years.
Yeah, and to be clear, and I want to thank the town attorneys, this came up through some questions from board members relative to the definition of compensation and relative to the idea that we're going to have a new first select person, and the fact that should we be looking at this in this vein. And when I posed the question, the question that the specific question was more along what did compensation mean and what's covered by that. I was surprised that the answer came back actually calling into question the whole past practice.
Surprised too.
Right, for any number of years regarding how it's been set. The problem we have as a board is the fact that, Mr. Hiller, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is we need to set this now as part of the budget process. But we're not going to have a real resolution on the legal ramifications of this in time, in enough time.
We have, one thing is clear, we have a charter obligation to deliver to the RTM 30 days in advance of their,
Right.
the annual meeting of the town, which is scheduled for May 2nd, a budget.
Right,
Obviously included in that would be the compensation, the salaries for the 4 positions that are under discussion.
Right.
One thing I would add, and the budget director reminds me, that in the, one thing that always has been, and this is past practice, has been part of the notice of the meeting for the annual meeting, which is always the first Monday in May. The salaries for those positions, those for the first selectman, the 2 selectmen, and the town clerk, has specifically been delineated in that notice of meeting.
right. And so it's in the notice of meeting, but it's not separately voted on, it's voted on part of the overall
Well,
budget.
it's not separately voted on. I think
Correct.
it in essence becomes separately voted on because you're theoretically
Right, so it
adopting
ties it to the
line by
budget process.
line
Understand.
of the 2 budgets that are
Right.
impacted here. The first.
But the RTM certainly never thought that that was the case, so I wouldn't agree with that. It may be spelled out separately, but they've never thought of it as a separate thing they could change or impact.
In other words, it might be form over substance as to how it is on the call.
It's embedded, the number is embedded within those salary lines along with other
Right.
employees in that department.
Right, I understand. Do we have questions or comments? Mr. Brockfeld?
You want to go first, Bob?
Yeah, the only thing I would say is, you know, for years we've been doing it one way, but the compensation, which I call medical and all that, hasn't, and the pension hasn't been as important maybe. You know, years ago, when we were thinking of pension, it wasn't a big factor. But now, when we're talking about switching people to 401Ks or whatever, you know, I think it's, to me, it's part of the whole package. And when I think of compensation for anyone, I think of, you know, the whole package. And also, I don't know how it's settled legally. You could have 10 different legal opinions on it, all different. So,
But if no other community in the state works that way, I don't think Fairfield's Board of Finance can decide out of the blue, we're going to operate different than everybody else in the world. No community sets benefits for their employees. No board, elected boards do. The only thing that, you know, the same with the state, you know, the legislature does ratify contracts, but all other powers are to the governor and the chief executive. So I don't think you can, I think you've got to accept there are certain limitations to what your authority is based on that. But the salary has been something set by elected boards. It's a question of which one, you know, has formal authority.
Do we know how the governor does it?
The package is put together by the executive branch. The only thing that's given to the legislature are negotiated benefits to ratify, but anything else is done by the executive branch.
Mr. Brockfeld?
It's an interesting issue. I would start by saying that since it has been thrown into question as to whether or not the Board of Finance was the right place to have voted for these for the last 15 years, maybe we should ask the first selectman to give back his pay for his entire.
so we can sort it out.
You have no problem with that, I assume, yeah. But seriously, it strikes me that there's actually 2 parallel ways, two parallel issues here. I think the first.
Maybe I could double my pay, too.
We could, that's right, there's no.
Compared to the hours I work, it probably, sometimes I think it should be.
There's 2 things going on here in my mind. I think that on the first hand, and I think there's a way possibly to finesse the difference, Chairman, and that is that I think what we're trying to do here is make clear to the employees of the town, regardless of what unit they're in, that the first selectman would be appropriate for him to have a benefit package that would be similar to the one that is being proposed, potentially proposed in various contracts. Personally, I think a 401k plan is better for the employee than the current system, but that's neither here nor there. And so at the same time, I'm sensitive to what the first selectman is saying, and I think what Tom is saying to some extent, which is that we're getting some very conflicting legal opinion, and we're also getting some totally new legal opinions even about the way it's been done in the past. So I would say that one way to split the difference here and achieve what I think we're trying to do would be to possibly consider some sort of, and I'm not good with the Robert's rules, but some sort of sense of the body from the Board of Finance to the RTM, if in fact they're the ones who probably appears have the real final say about what we're trying to say here and what we think might be the right direction to go in as an idea.
Well, again, the only role the RTM has is to set salary under state statute. So let's be clear. You can't start creating law and creating responsibilities that the RTM and the Board of Finance doesn't have. Whether you like it or not, that's the law. And laws are there for a reason. And the town attorney has a job to define the law. Every board has to adhere to the town attorney's opinions under our charter. That's what the charter says. So, unless a different attorney one day comes along and says that a former town attorney was wrong, that's what it says, and that's what you're bound by. Otherwise, every board could go off and do whatever they want, whenever they want.
it's
So that, I
interesting
think,
what
is
you
an
just
important
said.
principle.
Yeah, no, and Mr. Flato, it's interesting what you just said, because I think what we're trying to do is understand the charter. I don't think we're working at odds. I mean, you just said that.
No, but my point is to make recommendations beyond, or sense of the bodies
Well,
beyond.
you just said we had to follow with the town attorney's opinion because it's part of the charter, right? But apparently in setting the first selectman's compensation for the past number of years, we haven't been following the charter, because the charter would indicate that it's actually a vote by the Board of Selectmen that then comes to us and then goes down as part of the budget process, right? And I don't know where in the town charter it defines what compensation is. But I do know, and I'm not taking a position on it, but I do know that within the first selectman's lines, where it talks about that, it specifically says compensation. And when it talks about the town clerk, it specifically says salary.
But again, compensation is defined under state statute according to this as salary. So it's one small thought, though, and maybe this, I wish I'd been able to get on the phone, but the question is, because there has been a practice, does that in effect, become, the practice that can continue? While it may be, because it may be a Board of Selectmen said to a Board of Finance 50 years ago, do this for us.
Right.
And it may, we
And
just
I-
don't have the
and
institutional
I think
memory.
And I think what raised the issue anyway from the board members that discussed it was the whole concept of there not being enough check and balance. Not that anything, don't take that the wrong way. We're talking about a new chief executive coming in, not the existing chief executive, over the overall compensation package for the first selectman, because it's undefined or
But
ill-defined.
here's what I don't understand why anybody would make a statement like that.
Yeah.
If every first selectman in the history of the town has said, I'm not going to get benefits better than my department heads, how is that any, non-transparency, whatever? I mean, no one sought extra benefits. No first selectman has said, I want more. So all they're doing is getting whatever any other department head gets. And those policies don't change very often. I mean,
And that may or may not be the case. You're making a lot of, no first selectman, never.
well, at least
I-
in the last few decades. Yeah.
Yeah, the last 12 years, whatever.
Well,
You-
since
you
I've
know,
ever-
right.
Since the early 90s.
Anything anybody else wants to say on this item? Yeah, Mr. Brockfield.
Thank you. I would say that, just to follow up on the chain of thought that you guys were just talking about, the real risk, and I'll emphasize, because this is a sensitive topic, this is not in any way, shape, or form directed at our current first
I know,
selectman.
I know.
I think, but I just want to make sure everybody in the room understands that, everybody watching on TV understands, and everybody on the board understands this is a conceptual topic going forward, right? The only risk what you were just raising is that you're right. No first selectman, as far as you know, has asked for anything more than he has given to his top managers. But in a situation where a first selectman was less than transparent, he could certainly give his managers more in order for him to get, or her to get more. So yes. So I think what Tom is bringing up is that what is a eternal frustration for us on the board, those of us who are in or have been in or have experienced private business and then watch the way government operates, it's often frustrating for us to see the differences, and there are often reasons why there are differences. Government and business are different, and I've learned a lot up here that they don't always come together. But in a corporation, you never have a CEO in any way, shape, or form involved in setting his own compensation, whether it's benefits or salary. So it seems a little, I think,
the good
Tom,
news,
is that
though,
correct?
is,
Is that what the, yeah.
You know,
so.
I mean, and I'm not trying to talk too much, it's your meeting, I apologize, but I think, you know, the good news is.
It's an interesting discussion.
You know, but to some extent, I mean, in government, it's a given fact that anybody who wants to run for that type of position, a chief executive, is going to make usually 99% of the time less than they would make in a comparable private position. So it's certainly not a position one seeks to enrich themselves in unless they're going to be corrupt, and hopefully we'll never have that in this town. So it's not, you know, that kind of situation where you're looking to rein in over compensation like with a CEO making $100 million. It just doesn't happen in government. There are a lot of other issues that happen, but not that one.
I think it was an interesting process over the last few days to find all this out. Let's just put it like that. I'm not sure that we have a specific remedy to it, but it's pretty murky as to what role we should be playing. And I would only suggest, I have to suggest that when the charter comes back up for revision, this most assuredly needs to be concretely addressed, because I don't think it is right now. Mr. DeWitt.
A quick comment back to what the first selectman said, and then a follow-on for Mr. Hiller. If indeed the first selectman 50 years ago asked the Board of Finance to start doing this, I would have thought that would have yielded a charter revision, because the charter has been revised in the last 12 years, actually.
I'm revising the last 4 or 5
Yeah,
years.
exactly. So, I mean, I would have thought that I can understand in a time frame between a given period and the next revision of the charter where it might be an interim change, but there's been plenty of opportunity to change the charter. And I've lost my second train of thought. I know. Mr. Hiller said that we're obligated in the budget process to have a number in our budget by the May 2nd meeting. That number is just this year's selectmen and town clerk's salary numbers. Is there an obligation for us to have the entire 4 years?
That was our original
Well, I
understanding
think
from Mr. Hiller.
there's a couple of different issues here. First off, you're obligated to deliver by April 2nd, which is Sunday, a budget, or Saturday, rather,
Yeah.
a budget to the RTM.
I tried him too.
See if it's the attorneys.
Just as Paul, I mean, I'll just read one excerpt. You know, it says,
Great, but I'm in a meeting.
the state amendment limits, limits raising salary of a municipal official during their term. So it has to be set before the term starts.
Right.
Before the election. I mean, that's a state statute.
Right.
Right. I think our original question was, could we change the salary annually?
And the answer-
And the town attorney said, no, it's by
But it can be
every
done.
other 2 years,
It can be
right?
done every 2 years.
Right.
Which they had researched, I guess, 4
But
years ago.
but not within the term. It's got to be set for the
In
entire
advance.
term.
He set
but it can
before
be increased.
whatever election day is, or the first.
The one thing I would add to that, and I think there is an amendment to the state constitution regarding that, particularly in regards to a 4-year term, which is what we're looking at here, with the option to set it on a 2-year
right, that's
basis, but also to set it as to what it would be 2 years hence. In other words, what that salary would go to in November of 2013.
Right.
Yeah, I guess,
Mr. Saxel, Ms. Kennelly spell that out in this.
In another note, they did as well.
But I think when Eileen wrote in here, there's nothing to prevent the board from making its recommendation as it's done. That's her interpretation of what you've done in the past, but what she's saying is, those votes, there's nothing wrong with a vote. So it would seem to me,
Right.
you should take that step, because number one, we can't notice a meeting before the weekend, and that's 30 days, even if we wanted to under this. And number two, I'm sure my colleagues would agree with me, we'd like the Board of Finance to continue doing this. At least I unfortunately haven't talked to them, but I would bet that's the case, because again, it's setting selectmen salaries too.
it just sounds like if we were in a position to make a decision on this year's budget impact, we have till November, the timeframe
This
till
year's,
November.
the following
The
year's.
following year, right, to make the additional adjustments for
we
the
need-
second and third increases, if you will. If we're so,
There can only be, I think, one thing.
One
I'm sorry, one
There's only
increase.
a
Yeah,
one
right,
step
right.
Under
Yeah.
the state
But I see what
constitution as
what
amended.
Chris is saying is, if they set a total compensation for the selectmen budget
right,
with some parameters, that salary number could theoretically be defined later after the budget, because as long as it's within the
Right.
budget amount, the law says you have to set it in advance of the election.
With the other thing, yeah.
That's a possible another choice, but I think it's clearer, hopefully, for you to take some action
No.
tonight if you're willing.
without a town attorney decision, I guess, it's like, murky's a very good word for it.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Hiller, to clarify, can we take a vote tonight and set the budget, or set the budget tonight without deciding on the compensation for the next 4 years, as long as we decide on the compensation for the next 4 years before the November election? That's the question.
I don't know. I very honestly don't know the full answer to that. I think the one thing that if you had intent to increase the salaries over that, at least for the coming year, you would have to modify the salary line, the regular payroll line, within the Board of Selectmen budget.
Right.
Because that salary is embedded into that line.
Understand? So if we wanted to do, hypothetically, a 0% increase, go forward now, right, and then get better information, understand how we've been doing it, I think Mr. Flato makes an excellent recommendation, the history of how it became the way it is, right, the opportunity
Find it.
right, to understand the opinion a bit more, and then revisit the issue of setting the compensation for the 4-year term in total, assuming we're not going to change the first-year decision that was made tonight. Could we do it?
I think that potentially exists. Again, I think, when you say, how it got this way, I sit here having been, this is my 13th budget in this position that I now hold. I served 18 years on this board, and during that.
So it's your fault. No, I'm kidding.
And in addition, and in addition to that, in the mid-'80s, I chaired a Charter Revision Commission, and the past history over that in excess now of 30-some years has been that this board, and there's a little variance here, because I think, again, you're splitting the town clerk and the selectmen, or the.
We're not doing anything.
But in the past, frankly, it's never come up. I think the only time it came up for discussion was 4 years ago, and that really came up in discussion pertaining to the new 4-year term situation, how we handled that. Because prior to that time, of course, it had always been on a 2-year cycle.
Right.
But I would just, if you were thinking before this memo that you were prepared to vote tonight, I don't see why you would not do the normal process. I don't see what's going to change between now and a few months from now, except knowing who the candidates are. So I don't see why you wouldn't want to vote your recommendation, whether it's final or recommendation, why it wouldn't behoove you to just, make your thoughts known.
I'm a little uncomfortable, and I have no legal basis to hang my opinion on, but I know that I, as budget director, am required to publish 14 days minimum, this is state statute, prior to the RTM meeting, the budget, expenditures, revenues, and the proposed salary of the elected officials and the date upon which it starts. That I am required to do.
The
So I
proposed
need
salary,
to-
the proposed salary for the
For the
date it
elected
starts,
officials.
or for the entire term?
It's always been for the entire
It's got to
term.
be for the term.
It's got to be for the entire term.
Or the term which would
That's
start
my
in mid-November.
responsibility.
Whether
That's what
whether
the
you can
state-
change it afterwards, I don't know.
That's
You know,
what the
maybe
state law
that's the
requires
answer,
me to
But then
publish.
we could look into see whether you could modify it later.
So, here's a thought that I have, and I throw it out to my colleagues. We can vote on a 4-year salary in increments now, and we can recommend to the RTM that they look into the matter further relative to the charter as they look at this process of the compensation. And we can, therefore, if they want to address it before their vote, they can. And at least we fulfilled our obligation to pass along a budget. And we can get better clarification on what the role is of not just our board, but the Board of Selectmen, who are now done with this process, the Board of Finance that are trying to do its duty now, based on the charter, and then ultimately the RTM that has to approve it all anyway. Yeah.
Just a quick question. Would the RTM be held to only, would they only be able to reduce our number as in any other budget line item?
Yes, they would.
Okay. So we would be setting a, for all intent and purpose, a ceiling for which we would then hope the RTM could get enough data to possibly make an adjustment, given the circumstances,
Or at least understand the process.
or understand the process. Okay, great.
Yeah, Mr. Buff.
Thank you. I mean, that sounds okay. I guess the only thing we should understand, and I'm trying to do the math, it's always tough on the fly while you're trying to.
Sure.
But it sounds to me that if we were interested in at least introducing to the RTM the possibility of recommending that the first selectman go on to a defined contribution plan, and if we passed a budget with a 4-year number, a defined contribution plan almost by definition includes a town contribution, and there wouldn't be any money there if they chose to, if they chose to take that up, there wouldn't be any money for them to put it in
They're actually, they could use the contingency fund to do so.
contingency. Okay.
They could have it in contingency, and then they could move it if that's what they so choose.
That's correct.
Right.
Yeah, and in fact, there's a contract which has been publicly vetted, which is going to the RTM next month, which has that in there. And it will impact
Right.
many, many departments within this budget.
So financially, they have the flexibility that,
Yeah, but
There would be
the
funds
chair
set
is
aside.
correct that what would have to be done is we would have to come back at a later date and go and take money out of contingency for a specific line item for contributions.
and by the way, that's going to happen with the ongoing negotiations of the labor contracts anyway.
Won't be the first time we go there this year.
Right. Right.
Sounds like a good.
I think that's a good.
Okay. So with that, if it's okay, I'll take the lead, and I would make a motion that we leave the first selectman's salary at its present amount for the next 2 years, and then in the third year of their term, we raise the salary by 3%. Do I have a second to that motion? We have a second to that motion. That motion is now before us. The reason I did it like that was because state statute clearly defines that we're only allowed to raise the salary once during the term. We could give an increase now, and then we could only give an increase once more during the term. Given what the first selectman is working on with the unions right now, I didn't feel it prudent to go ahead and ask the unions to work with them as well as the unions, many of them in their, took zeros last year or contemplating taking zeros for last year, since those contracts haven't been settled.
Yeah, this current year.
So I think that this position needs to lead by example with that, and that's why I made that motion. Do you have any questions, comments, concerns on that motion? Mr.
I
Stone?
just want to make sure. So, in other words, this thing is set for the next 4 years then?
Yes.
All right. So, in other words, we can,
Subject to RT, if the,
Yeah, well, I
Subject to
know that, I
RTM
know that.
approval.
so the statute says we can only vote on it once, or we can only raise it once?
We can't vote on it during the term.
Okay, that's all I need.
And it says that we can only raise it once in the midst of the term, correct?
correct.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments, concerns on this? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? It passes unanimously for the first selectman. Can we do the two selectmen positions, please? Does anybody have a motion on that? Do you want to do it, Mr. Brown? Do we want to do the same thing we did for the first selectman?
3% after
2 years?
2 years? I would make a motion for that.
Okay, could you make that motion?
Okay, I make a motion that for the first 2 years, the selectmen salaries remain the same, and 2 years from now, there's an increase of 3%.
Do we have a second to that? Ms. Leclerc? Any questions, comments, concerns from board members on that? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Mr. DeWitt? Abstentions? Okay, that passes as well. So we're done with the first selectman and the selectman. Mr. Brockfeld, did you have any comments on what you would like? You had mentioned before making a motion or something. Did you have any sense of the body, or are you good there? You had just mentioned it, and I didn't, as we move on and bring our colleagues back in, I didn't want that hanging out
You also
there.
have the town clerk,
We're going to let, we're going to
We'll
have...
do the, we want our colleagues to come back in for that.
and I don't know if Kenny's motion would apply to both?
I'm sorry?
I don't know if Ken's motion would apply to both?
Yeah, would your motion apply to both?
To the,
Well, you know what, since it would encompass as one position, and I think that's the reason they recused themselves, I think you should talk to the motion now.
so,
Thank you, Ken.
a motion for sensitive body?
Yeah, well, how do you want to,
Well, I just, a motion, I would propose a motion that there be a sense of the body from the Board of Finance to the RTM, that the Board of Finance recommends that the RTM consider, both in a practical and legal sense, the movement of the first selectman's benefit package to a 401K style defined contribution plan, and a higher, do we want to just stick with the pension?
no, keep going. I mean, it's your motion, so.
Well, we're working. Let's just leave it at that,
Okay.
to the, on the pension.
Does anybody have,
Yes. To be researched and considered.
so Mr., is there a second to that? It's Mr. Stone. So, Mr. Stone, your motion is that you would like the RTM to research the question that we had earlier and consider relative, can we change it to, would you entertain a motion to change it relative to the compensation package of the first selectman and the role of the town boards in setting those packages?
Debbie, are you okay with it?
You know, again,
Yes, I think
again,
that's
if it's-
I think
if they have
that-
that legal.
I think that says, that has the same spirit, and I think is more to the point, so yes.
So you would entertain, Deb, can you get this?
No, I'll have to get it off the tape.
Okay, I'll make it then.
Yeah.
I make a motion to adjust Mr. Brockfeld's motion to ask that the RTM research this issue regarding first selectman and selectman compensation, the role of town boards in setting it, and the definition of compensation as a whole relative to those positions.
Can I make,
Yeah.
I think that's excellent, but I also wanted to, as long as we brought the topic up, I think we should also put in there specifically researching and considering the structure of the pension.
Of a defined contribution.
Yeah. Because I think we're trying to send a message to our town's employees, that's what we're considering for them should be also good for the chief executive.
Fair enough. I will accept his adjustment to that. Do I have a second to that? Okay. Are we good? Okay, that motion is now before the part of the board that was in here for the discussion. I think you were called in a little early, gentlemen. Questions, comments, concerns, discussion? Okay, all in favor? Mr.
Actually,
Slater?
one last comment. Since, as you probably know, the RTM can only take action during a public meeting, doesn't have any facility to research, doesn't have that ability, whatever, they can individually do whatever they'd like. I will take it upon myself to, since I only got this afternoon myself, to reach out to CCM, that's the, conference for all the municipalities. There's got to be some, I would think there's got to be some information about this. I assume Eileen did that already, but I'll try to check all those things, and I'll try to have whatever information we can present to the RTM and as well to yourselves over the next few weeks.
Thank you, and I do want to commend, this issue just came up within the last couple of days.
It's a bit of a shocker.
I appreciate everybody, the town attorney's hard work at least looking at this on our behalf, as well as everybody else, and I thank them for their efforts. Okay, seeing no questions, comments, concerns, let's take a sense of body on that motion of the members that were here for it, please. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions. Okay, that motion carries unanimously among the 6, and 3 were recused from that, okay? All right, now before us is the town clerk's compensation. Actually, the town clerk's, specifically the salary of the town clerk. Do we have a motion on the salary for the town clerk? Mr. DeWitt, do you have a motion? 0 and 3?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I make a motion the town clerk's salary be held constant for the next 2 years at 0% and 3% increase the remaining 2 years after.
Okay, do we have a second to that motion? Mr. Bolito? Okay, do we have questions, comments, concerns on that? Seeing none, please.
The town clerk's, what's the term? Is it 2 years?
It's 4 years.
Oh, that's 4 years, okay.
Yep.
All right.
Okay. Other questions, comments? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Did you vote?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I think that carried unanimously, correct? Mr. Tetra, you voted as well? I did not see your hand. Thank you. Okay, now we'll go to the items before us, which are the department as a whole. Each department, what I'm going to do is read down the departments, take motions for any adjustments. Seeing none, if we see none, we'll vote on it. If we see some, we'll have the motion, and we'll go from there. We're going to start with the Board of Selectmen. I'm going to go down page 3 of our budget book, the table of contents. I'm just going to use that, take it in that order. One exception to that. One exception to that. I'm going to ask that we save the human resources budget for last. Okay? Given some of the concerns we've had with it. Yeah, well, I'm just going to go right down the glossary. That's what I'm going to do.
Well, no, you don't. Oh, okay.
I'm just going to go in that order.
And I've got this spreadsheet up if anybody wants.
Yeah.
Well, it's page 33
That definition?
Yeah.
Roman numeral 3.
Roman numeral 3.
Roman numeral.
He's going to write down the glossary of the
Roman numeral. I'm
table
sorry.
of contents. It is on 33.
I was just trying to see if you were paying attention.
33.
This is already made.
Yeah, I got it.
All right,
All right. So,
okay.
now before us is the Board of Selectmen's budget. Questions, comments, concerns on that budget?
Kind of don't.
Seeing none, I'm going to take a vote. All in favor?
Do we have to adjust the salary, or,
No, we do not have,
On that.
yeah.
okay.
All right. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? That budget is done. Let's go to the town clerk's budget. Questions, comments, concerns on that? Seeing none, all in favor? Mrs. Leclerc, my apologies, I missed you. Go ahead.
Okay, we would then adjust the total budget. I'd like to make a motion to adjust the total overall budget by 500.
I think that's administrative services, or is that? Okay,
Okay, never mind.
okay. Any questions, comments, concerns on this budget? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? We're done there. Okay, Administrative Services is the next budget. Do we have any questions, comments, concerns on that budget?
All right.
Mrs. Leclerc?
Now I'll make my motion. I'd like to adjust the total budget by 500, just to bring the total increase down to 3%.
Okay.
You reduce it?
No, just by 500.
Show me which line you're on.
No,
No.
just the total at the
At the top side.
department head's discretion.
Okay, any questions, comments, concerns on that?
Is there a second?
Is there a second to that? Mr. DeWitt? We did it. First and second. Oh, yeah, we did. Thank you, Mr. Tetro. I forgot that because you guys left the room. Okay, so we got the first and second on that, so that is now before us. All in favor? Okay, that has been adjusted by $500. The budget as adjusted is now before us. The budget for the department stands at 102,528 after that adjustment, correct, Mrs. Gardner? Yep. Okay, so that is now before us. All in favor of that budget? Opposed? Abstentions? That budget passes. We have the Registrar of Voters budget is now before us. Mrs. Gardner, please confirm that budget was adjusted by $15,000 by the Board of Selectmen.
15095.
Okay, so that budget now stands at $260,563. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so that is the budget line now before us? Okay. Questions, comments, concerns on that budget? Okay, seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, that budget is done. Let's go to the Zoning Board of Appeals. Budget is now before us. Questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? That budget passes unanimously. Town Planning and Zoning. Questions, comments, concerns on that budget? Emotions? None? All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? That budget passes. Probate Court is now before us. Questions, comments, concerns, motions? None? All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? I like not having to look for the first and second. Thank you for reminding me. All right, Historic District Commission. That budget is now before us. Questions, comments, concerns? Motions? None? All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? None. Conservation Commission. Budget is now before us. Questions on this budget? Comments, motions?
Can I ask a question?
Please.
When you say the budget is before us, is that from the budget book? That's not adjusted?
No,
If you've
that's
made
before
any
us.
adjustments to it?
That's
you will
what's
tell
been,
me what the amount will be?
exactly correct. Mrs. Gardner will have it. It's not from the budget book, it's from whatever the Board of Selectmen.
Selectmen's recommendation.
Correct. Okay?
Yep.
Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? That's done. Okay, the Shellfish Commission. Questions, comments, motions? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Okay. Legal Services. Now, this was also adjusted by the Board of Selectmen,
Yes, down 18,000.
down 18,000. The number before us is $540,000. Questions, comments, concerns on this budget? Mr. Stone?
I know it was adjusted down, but I'm still concerned about the, all the appeals that could come before us with the reassessment. So I just want to bring that up.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Stone. Any questions or motions on that budget? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Mr. Stone, abstentions? Okay, one opposition was Mr. Stone. Okay. The budget now before us is miscellaneous contingencies. Any questions, comments, concerns on this budget? Motions? None? All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Okay. Budget passes. We are going to hold off on human resources Okay, we're going to go to the Community and Economic Development budget. Please. I'm sorry?
We're going to cover retiree benefits at another point?
As part of HR.
Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you. Community and Economic Development, questions, comments, concerns to that budget?
Page 72.
Page 72. Thank you, Mr. DeWitt. Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Okay. Harbor Management Commission. Questions, comments? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, Land Acquisition Commission. I'm not even going to look. Mr. DeWitt.
May I make my yearly motion to reduce the Land Acquisition Commission to zero?
So it's a reduction of $1,000.
To $1,000.
Okay. Do we have a second to that? Mr. Bolito? Questions, comments, concerns? Okay, all in favor of that motion? Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, so the budget is now before us at zero. Any other motions? Seeing none, all in favor of that budget? Opposed? Abstentions? That motion carries. That budget is done. Contingency, page 81. The contingency budget's now before us. Questions, comments? Okay, seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? That carries. All right, now I'm going to ask that we take pages 83 through 124. So I'm going to read these. It's RISAP, Pequot Library, Fairfield Counseling Services, the Discovery Museum, Greater Bridgeport Regional Planning Agency, Audubon Society, Greater Bridgeport Transit Authority, Fairfield Museum and History Center, Fairfield Veterans Advisory and Information Service, Southwestern Connecticut EMS Council, Southwestern Regional Mental Health Board, Southwestern Regional Communications Center, Council of Churches Janus Center, Grassmere by the Sea, Sullivan and McKinney Elder Housing, Fairfield Arts Council, the Kennedy Center, Mill River Wetland Committee, the Pilot House, and the Center for Women and Families, that we take all those budgets together as really our not-for-profit services area of the budget. Remember, we can adjust any one of these budgets that anyone would like separately, but I just want to go through it and vote on it all at one time. Mr. Kiley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make a note that I would ask the chairman if we could vote on one of the agencies, the Pilot House, separately from the group.
Okay.
And the reason for that is I'm an advisory board member for that group, and I wish to abstain on that vote. I certainly support the $8,000, but I think it's best I abstain.
Thank you, Mr. Kiley. I appreciate that. So we will consider the Pilot House separately. Questions, comments on any of the other budgets that are before us in this round? Okay. Seeing none? Oh, Mr. Fleda.
Excuse me, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Flynn. I had, there were two errors at the Board of Selectmen level that, that in reflection that I'd like to bring before you tonight. One of them is relating to Grassmere. If you remember at the hearing, I had indicated that I made a fairly large cut under the presumption that we could restore or make up the difference through our block grant program. Since that kind of December, January period, we've gotten pretty good sense that next year we're probably going to get a reduced allocation, unfortunately, from the federal government in CDBG. And, you know, Mark indicated to me while he could perhaps do half that, he wouldn't be able to go all the way. The intent wasn't to single Grassmere out, and I erred in not bringing it up the other day. We were so absorbed in other things, I just neglected to remember it. So I just asked the board's consideration if you might consider the possibility of restoring $10,000 of what the first selectman or the board of selectmen voted on as a $20,000 reduction in their request as a possibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fleda. Does anyone have a motion to make, given Mr. Fledo's comments? Take it, well, we can take it right now and vote on it all together if we'd like. Yeah, Mr. Tetra?
Mr. Chair, I would move that we go along with the first selectman's suggestion and add the 10,000 back in.
Okay, do I have a second?
I'll
That's
second that.
Mr. Kiley. Okay, that motion is now before us. We'll vote on that motion, and then we can vote on everything separately. Okay, any questions, comments, concerns on that motion? Seeing none, all in favor of adding the $10,000 back to Grassmere? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4. Abstentions, motion carries. That $10,000 is restored to the Grassmere by the sea. Okay, so now, as revised, all those budgets are back before us. Questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, all in favor of these budgets taking collectively, raise your hand. Opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Opposed? 1, 2, 3. That motion carries, and all of those budgets are approved. Now before us is the Pilot House. Mr. Kiley will be abstaining. Any questions, comments, concerns from board members regarding this budget? Seeing none, all in favor of the Pilot House? Opposed? Okay, abstentions, and we have 7, 1, and 1 on that, with Mr. Kiley abstaining, Mr. Baligo voting against. Okay, now before us is the private school bus transportation. It's page 126 of our budget book. Do we have any questions, comments, concerns on this budget? Seeing none, seeing no motions, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? That motion, that budget carries. Health and Welfare Services, page 128, is now before us. Questions, comments, concerns on Health and Welfare Services? We're a little out of order here? Nope. Nope, Finance comes next.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, Health and Welfare Services. Questions, comments, concerns on this budget? Yep,
I don't have it in my schedule.
okay. Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? That passes. Now we're in the Finance Department. Questions, comments, concerns on this budget? Okay. Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? That one's done. The purchasing budget is now before us. Mr. Bolito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would make a motion to reduce that budget by $2,000, specifically the line items of travel and educational and memberships to prior year levels.
Thank you, Mr. Bolito. Do I have a second to that motion? Mr. DeWitt? Questions, comments, concerns from board members on that? Seeing none, all in favor of reducing this budget by $2,000 in the travel, entertainment, and educational membership lines to prior year levels? Opposed? Abstentions? That motion carries. Okay, that budget as amended is now before us. I believe the budget amount now, Ms. Gardner, is $294,660? Is that correct? Oh, okay. Questions, comments, concerns on this? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? That budget is done. The Assessor's Office, if I'm correct, the Board of Selectmen made an adjustment for $10,000, raising this budget due to the increase in assessment appeals. Is that correct, or what's?
Really in anticipation that we might have to get professional services for appraisals as a result of the appeals.
Yeah, he had indicated that there was many more appeals had come in just very recently, as I recall.
Yeah, they start hearings tomorrow. There are over 600 appeals that have been filed.
Okay,
And Mr. Brown is concerned that, obviously, and 20 of those are commercial properties that are automatically going to court, and that we will need professional appraisals done.
We're about 200 less than 5 years ago.
Yeah. That 600 figure compares to over 900 5 years ago.
wow. Okay. Questions, comments, concerns? Yes,
Quick question.
please?
Why would we not have them take that out of contingency if needed, as opposed to budgeting it now?
I think one of the things, if you look at the description in the miscellaneous contingency account, which was previously acted upon, we've often done that, particularly for appraisals where the town might be purchasing some property or stuff like that, but this is, these are appraisals that are specific to the department and specific to the assessor's actions and the actions of the Board of Assessment Appeals, which budget has been embedded into this budget now.
So maybe okay, so where I may have misunderstood it was that these are appeals that we know have been filed. This is work that,
We are aware right now, and don't hold me to the exact number, we know of 20 commercial appeals. Under the statute, commercial properties with assessed value in excess of $1 million can automatically be passed by the Board of Assessment Appeals and go directly to Superior Court. That action has been taken, and the Board of Assessment Appeals will not hear those. So we know there are 20 commercial properties. It may be one or two more. I don't know the exact number, but it's roughly 20, that the papers have been filed with Superior Court.
meaning we go to court?
I'm sorry?
Meaning we go to court?
Well, the papers would be filed, but, there will obviously be
Or we could go to
negotiations
court, I should say.
And things of that nature, but, it can be an elongated process.
The town defends those appeals, and sometimes we need an expert. I think 5 years ago, that actually ended up coming partly out of the town attorney's budget and partly out of the miscellaneous. And just to help fill in, when our board talked about it, when the members talked about reducing the town attorney, there was a thought that while the assessment side is the wild card, since the costs were shared in a few budgets last time, why not put a little bit more in the assessor's budget to offset the fact that we cut the town attorney's budget? But it could come out of the miscellaneous account, but if we exhaust that, we'd have to obviously ask you for a transfer from the general contingency. So it's one of those just wild cards.
Thank you. Questions, comments, concerns? Okay, the budget as adjusted by the Board of Selectmen is now before us. All in favor? Opposed? Abstention? Abstention? Okay. So Mr. Brockfeld abstained from that. Okay, tax collector's budget is now before us. Questions, comments, concerns on this budget? Motions? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? None? Okay, that budget is now before us. The information technology budget, this was also adjusted by the Board of Selectmen, down by $25,000. So that budget is revised by the Board of Selectmen, is now before us. Questions, comments, concerns on that budget? Seeing none, all, yes, Mr. Tetro.
Somewhere in the last few days to a week, we got a memo from the, I believe it was the ECC, talking about, or
That's
the
correct.
ruggedized laptops or computers.
Actually,
A
this,
different price point.
yes.
Did we decide, I'm not seeing that adjustment here,
Yes,
so
that
did we decide?
adjustment is here. That adjustment, they added, the Board of Selectmen added $5,868 to accommodate that, and then reduced capital $25,000. So the net effect is a reduction of $19,132.
Thank you for the correction.
So the net adjustment is,
Down $19,132,
okay,
Right.
so,
but specifically increased the ruggedized laptops.
okay, can
Right, 'cause
somebody
it was-
step us through the numbers?
It's all in capital. The item that requested $30,000 for the ruggedized laptop was adjusted upward by $5,868.
What's the total for the department that we're voting on right now?
$1,606,912.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Okay, Mr. Tetra,
Yes, thank you.
questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Mr. Stone, abstentions. Okay, that budget passes.
Stone was opposed or abstained?
Opposed. And then we're going on to the Board of Finance budget. Mr. Polito, break my heart here. No, there you
We should have our salaries doubled. I'd like to make a motion, please, on line number 53200, fees and professional services, to knock that down by $1,900, which would put the increase at 5% year over year.
Great. Do I have a second to that motion? Seconded by Mr. DeWitt. Questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? There are none. That budget as adjusted is now before us. Let's make sure I have the right number, Mrs. Gardner, this time, 96,563? Okay?
Sorry, what is it, 96,563?
Yep, that's the budget. Okay. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Okay. That budget passes. Unemployment compensation. Mr. Kiley?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I move to increase this budget by $30,000, bringing it to a total of $200,000.
Okay.
The reason for that is the current year, we're on a run rate to end up the year at around $210,000, give or take some change, and that's pretty consistent with the prior year. And I do not believe I saw any evidence that would indicate that next year's unemployment insurance would be any less. Therefore, I think the account's a bit light.
Do I have a second to that motion? Mr. Bolito, questions, comments, concerns, or motions from board members? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Mr. Stone, abstentions. Okay, Mr. Stone is opposed. Okay, and everything else passed. Okay. Fire department budget is... Oh, you're right. That was for the adjustment. Thank you very much, Mr. Bolito. After 20-some-odd departments, I'm getting a little flustered here. Okay, so that budget at $200,000 is now before us. Any questions, comments, concerns on the budget as a whole there? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? What do you know? It's the same vote count. Okay. Let's go to public safety, the fire department. We'll go to Mr. DeWitt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I make a recommendation. We reduce this line item by $25,000 in accord with the current year spending and the projection for next year.
Any slide?
I would leave it at the discretion of the chief.
Okay, so it's a $25,000 adjustment to the fire department budget at the discretion of the department head. So, do we have a second to that motion? Mr. Brown, questions, comments, concerns on this?
Just for Mr. DeWitt, what was the reason for it?
The run rate this year, what the budget's looking like, it will come in at this year, as opposed to what it's predicted to come in at next year.
Okay, questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, so that budget is now before us as adjusted by $25,000. If I have it correctly, Ms. Gardner, the new budget is $13,525,985. Got it, okay. That budget is now before us in total. Questions, comments, concerns, motions? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? One opposition, Mr. Stone. Okay, the police department budget. Were there any adjustments to this budget, Mrs. Gardner? No adjustments to this budget. Do we have any questions, comments, concerns, or motions? Mr. Bolito?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would make a motion to reduce this budget by a total of $158,695. There are specific line items. I'll take those one by one. Motor vehicle fuel, which is line number on page 162, line number 54150. I would make a motion to reduce that line item by $47,000 to bring the overall increase to 10%. The line item maintenance repair of equipment, which is the next line at 54310, I would make a motion to reduce that by $9,500, which would put that at an overall 10% increase. Communications, which is line item 55300, I would make a motion to reduce that by $4,500. That would bring that to an overall 10% increase. Then on overtime earnings, line item 51050 toward the top of the page, I would ask that, make a motion that that be reduced by $19,000. overtime earnings replacement. That is line item 51055. I would make a motion to knock that down by $19,250. And then going over to page number 164, there is a proposed full-time position. It's listed as new police IT and communications, fourth line down under full-time. I would ask that that line item be reduced to zero. The amount of reduction would be $59,445. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bolito, and that adjustment comes... Yep, and that adjustment comes to 158,695 to the budget as a whole for that department. Do I have a second for that motion? Mr. DeWitt, questions, comments, concerns on the motion from board members? Seeing none, I'll ask for a vote just on the motion. Yes, Mr. Flato.
That seemed like a fairly comprehensive, surprising list to me. I guess I would ask, there's a few of these lines I'm particularly concerned about. The repair lines in particular, I think this department has managed their budget pretty well the last few years. They haven't had any overages. They've been pretty careful about managing their budget. And I guess, when it comes to repair of equipment, things like that, repair of automobiles, it's very hard to predict which things may really break, especially with the cars and car accidents, if they have to absorb some of that. I think on the OT, we've all had the same concern. I can understand a concern about trying to limit OT. I don't have as much problem with that. But I would just ask you to think perhaps a little more about the repair lines. And then the last quick comment is just on the position. I can understand this is a very difficult environment to consider a position, and I thought long and hard about, this is the only one pretty much that I left in the budget. The goal is to try to, and I think you heard some of this at the hearing, but I don't remember how much time they dealt on it. The goal was to really get a kind of more technically inclined person in the department to deal with their technology infrastructure, thereby freeing up an officer. They did, if you remember, over the last couple of years, we did have some restructuring that did save some officer shifts and reduce, they had a pretty big cut that we had to manage last year. I think it was about $150,000 or something like that, from the 08-09 budget to the 09-10 budget, that they did absorb and they did manage. So this was an effort to try to get that staffing a little back to where we had it. And as you know, their workforce, in terms of personnel, is on the low side, compared to a lot of other medium communities. So the only three I just ask you to perhaps think a little about for a couple of minutes would be the two small repair lines that you were proposing and possibly that position, but in particular the repair lines. Appreciate your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Flato. Any questions, comments, concerns on this motion? Okay, the motion is now before us. I'm going to ask for a vote just on the motion, then we'll go to the department as a whole. All in favor of the motion to cut $158,695 from this budget as detailed out by line item by Mr. Bolito? All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? That carries unanimously. The budget is now before us. Mrs. Gardner, please help me out. $14,722,152. Beautiful. Okay, so the motion, the budget before us has now been adjusted by the motion, and it's now before us. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? That budget passes. Now, the animal control budget is before us. Questions, comments, concerns, motions? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Animal control passes. We'll go to streetlights. Streetlights is now before us. Questions, comments, concerns? All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Streetlights pass. Hydrants and water service. Questions, comments, concerns, motions? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Hydrants and water service passes. Emergency management. Any questions, comments, or motions? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? That passes. Emergency Communications Center. Questions, comments, concerns on those line items? That budget is now before us. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Emergency Communication Center is done. All right. We're going to go to Public Works next. Everyone, I wanted to do the departments first, knowing that we had department heads here, to be respectful of their time. We will come back and do revenue at the end of the budget. I just wanted everyone to be aware of that, okay? So let's go to Public Works. Public Works Administration, that budget is now before us. Questions, comments, concerns on that budget?
This was revised by the Board of Selectmen.
Please.
To roll in the flood and erosion control budget.
Oh, it does, okay.
Yes, so one is
Oh,
offset
okay.
by the other.
Perfect.
One increases 1,500.
Do we need to do any vote on the flood and erosion control then, or does it no longer exist?
Why don't you vote on it as a zero,
Fine?
as recommended by the Board of Selectmen, to make it clean?
Okay. Please.
Yes, and to, and.
Okay,
and
I'll
then
tell you what, I will make that motion when we get there, okay? Okay, Public Works Administration is now before us. Questions, comments, concerns? All,
572,980.
okay, all in favor? Opposed, abstentions? That carries unanimously. Public Works Operations is now before us. Mr. Kiley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Linda and Deb, I've got a few things here, a few numbers that, if you can keep up with me and keep a running tab on me. I move to adjust this budget downward by $78,754. And those figures and explanations come from the following areas. The first area is contracted property services. I move to reduce that line by $49,104, which is equivalent to the increase that's in this year's budget. The thinking there was keep it flat year over year, make do with what we have, figure it out.
Can you say the line item?
Contracted property services, 49104 is the dollar amount. Okay? The next line is seasonal payroll. I move to reduce that line by $14,400. And what that does is that leaves that line intact at a 3% increase over last year. The next line is fees and professional services. And I move to reduce that line by $8,200. And that reduction would leave a 5% increase in that line year over year. The next line is cleaning and janitorial services. I move to reduce that line by $1,800. And that will leave that line at a 3% increase over last year after the reduction. The next line is postage. I move to reduce that line by $1,000, which is equivalent to this year's requested increase, which keeps the budget flat year over year. The next line is maintenance and repair equipment. I move to reduce that line by $3,250. $3,250. And after that reduction, that line will maintain a 5% increase over last year. So in every case, it either leaves the line at 3% or 5% above last year. In the cases of contracted property services and postage and travel, it keeps those three lines flat year over year. And the grand total of all those numbers comes to $78,754.
I missed something, because my total doesn't.
Did you miss
You missed the travel line.
travel?
Oh, I missed the travel, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay, because my total didn't.
And it's the same thing there, a $1,000 recommended reduction, which would leave that line flat year over year. I apologize for that.
Sure.
49,104, I'm just repeating.
49104,
14,400,
14,400,
8,200,
correct,
1,800,
correct,
1,000,
1,000,
3,250,
3,250 and 1,000 again. Yes, ma'am. 78,754.
Okay, so do we have a second to that motion? Mr. Brockfeld has the second. The motion now before us is to reduce the Public Works operation budget by those line items enumerated by Mr. Kiley by a grand total of 78,754. The motion is now before us. Question, comments, concerns? Mr. Fleta.
Thank you. Sometimes it's handy to be ex officio. Thank you for your patience. There's just one line. Obviously, our departments will try to tighten their belts. That's the message that we're all been sending, and you're sending even more tonight. But there is one line I'm a bit concerned about that I would ask you to consider modifying a little bit out of these, and that's the contract property services line. There are two things happening in this budget that will necessitate, I believe, at least some increase. And my request would be if one of you might want to consider as a modification or the mover a possibility of, as opposed to cutting it entirely, to cut it approximately in half or by 2/3. There are a series of bids that were rolled over for a second year because we got bids at a pretty good time in the depth of the reception. I know Twig and I have talked a little about will some of those prices hold or not. We're hopeful, but we just don't know. So that's one of the reasons that that line, had this kind of increase. There was some concern from Public Works, but the other biggie is that line will be, this year, it's not going to have any savings because of the snow situation. It is the area where they do hire those extra, haulers and payloaders and all that stuff when they have to. So I guess I'm hoping it might coax you into considering perhaps 15,000, 18,000 back of that, or to maybe put a 1.5% increase or something like that. So I appreciate your consideration of that.
Thank you, Mr. Fleta.
I'm open to talking about it.
Does anybody want to bring that up?
Thank you, Mr. Flato.
Mr. Brockfeld?
Sure, I'll make a motion to amend Mr. Kiley's motion that the contracted property services be reduced by 35,000 rather than 49,000 based on the first selectman's explanation.
Be reduced by 35,000?
Right. Instead of reducing it by 49, reduce it by 35, and then so that's what, a $14,000 adjustment.
Mr. Kyler, do you have anything to say on that?
No, I think it seems reasonable, and, the Public Works guys do a great job for us, and Mr. Flato makes a good case for it. I have no objection to that.
Mr. Chair.
Yep. Yes, can we have a second? Mr. Tetro seconds that. So the motion as amended is now before us. Can we have a new total, please?
Yes.
Yeah, instead of 49. I'm just saying.
64,650.
Yep.
Total reduction of 64,650.
64,650. That is the motion of reduction before us.
Yeah.
Questions, comments, concerns from board members on that? Okay, all in favor of that motion? Opposed? Abstentions? We've got one opposition, Mr. DeWitt. Now the budget as amended, and Linda, can you give us a new total, please?
Yes, 14,444,218.
$14,444,218. The Public Works operation budget is now before us. Okay, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions. So Mr. Stone's opposed. Okay. Now, flood and erosion control. This budget is now before us at zero, as put forth by the Board of Selectmen. I'm going to make the motion that we accept the budget at zero, as well as we consolidate the budget with the Public Works and Administration budget going forward. Do I have a second to that? Mr. Bolito, any questions, comments, concerns? Great. Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? It's the easiest one of the night. All right. It gets added to the administration, Public Works Administration. Thank you, Mr. DeWitt. Okay, the Building Department is now before us. Questions, comments, concerns on this budget? Seeing none, any motions? None. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries unanimously. Please note Mr. Brockfeld out of the room. Okay, engineering is now before us. Questions, comments, concerns on this budget? Seeing none, motions, none. All in favor? Opposed, abstentions? That budget carries. That's the end of the Public Works area. We are now into Health and Welfare Services. We have the Health Department before us. It's page 205. Questions, comments, concerns on the Health Department? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? That passes unanimously. Mr. Brockfeld's still out of the room. Okay, let's just note that. Human and Social Services is now before us. Questions, comments? I think Mr. Flato wants to be heard on this one.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just an informational item, and it was my own proposal, but at the Board of Selectmen, kind of spontaneously, we were looking through various things, and I made a motion to reduce, there's one part-time position that was in that budget for the last couple of years that had been created after the merger of, from FSW privatization going to the town. We were trying to figure out what was the right staffing, and just for the record, just to give you the history, the total department did drop by 1.5 people between social service and human services 2 years ago when we combined them. Ms. Grace came to me about 2 years ago, or a year after that, and said that she felt that we just needed some additional program work with the senior center and requested a part-time position. Well, the position hadn't been filled. Last year, I had told them to freeze it because of the economic situation. But this summer, I did give permission to go forward with the position, but I thought it had not been filled, and I figured since it didn't seem to be that much of a necessity to hold off on it. Well, unbeknownst to me, just totally coincidentally, she and the Personnel Department had finalized an offer literally last week and made an offer to a person to fill that position who just started this week. So we're in a bit of an awkward position where we reduced a line that they had thought they had in this year's budget is not a problem, but going forward, if we continue the reduction. So I guess I would ask to your consideration to consider adding back either the full 30,000 or most of it for the person to at least work 2 to 3 days a week. It's a person with a professional background in senior services and medical services. It certainly is an operation to benefit the seniors of the town. I think the potential is there for this person to have a pretty big impact. So I feel bad that I did not have that information on Tuesday, because it probably wouldn't have been a profile issue. So I just wanted to explain what happened and ask you to consider restoring perhaps $25,000 of the $30,000 for that position.
Thank you, Mr. Flato. Mr. Stone.
When we hired this person, did they know about the budget? I mean, what was going on?
Well, Claire came up with and Mary came up with an hourly rate based on the credentials of the person and based on the budget that annualized would be pretty close to what that budget was. But again, the offer was made last week. I didn't hear about it until yesterday, and the payroll hasn't even been processed yet. The person was just starting. So
If we don't approve this,
we
what
would
happens
have
to that
to
person?
probably inform the person that we would not be able to do that kind of continued work. So it's a bit of a unusual situation.
Okay.
And again, my intent wasn't to not, I felt the need was there over the last year, but because the department hadn't done anything with it, I was like, well, you had this need, but you didn't do anything. But it was partly because we froze it last year, and it apparently took them a while to find the right candidate and to find someone they felt was a good fit. So that's a bit of a tough one, but if it's possible to consider a good chunk of it, we could try to, if you could perhaps maybe do even $20,000, we could try to find within the other lines $10,000 to make up for it if she wants to keep to the 3-day-a-week schedule. But I would ask your consideration of, say, $20,000 of this back.
Thank you, Mr. Flato. Mr. DeWitt, you had a question?
We had budget in last year's, we had a line
In the
item in
current-
last year's budget to pay for this. So can we get, maybe we can transfer the April to July portion, anything but the April to July portion of that budget to our internal service fund.
Well, this year, the money...
This year's budget.
This year, the money just won't be spent, it'll go into surplus. I mean, because we already have a budget, so it would just flow into our surplus at the end of this year. I don't know how we roll it. I
I
suppose
guess
we
we
could...
could go with surplus, that's fine, yeah.
Well, the way we
So that
could-
money will go to surplus?
Oh, absolutely. I
This
mean,
whole-
what
that
we
whole
could
line item will
consider
go to
doing,
surplus.
I know we're getting a little digression here. What you could consider doing later this spring
Right.
is if our accounts look pretty good, you know, I know there's a few departments with problems, but most of the departments are in pretty good shape. If you feel there's some savings that's coming in some departments this year, you could later on this year add some money to the risk fund from contingency, because we still have an ample contingency.
It just
But
seems
that,
that
but it's kind of early to do that without kind of seeing,
more,
say, the...
more and more
line of-
I keep hearing about positions that we funded that weren't filled, that are three-quarter or two-thirds of the year, you know, gone already, so we've got two-thirds of a line, a pretty substantial line item that we could possibly use, rather than to just, you know, peanut butter spread it across the other holes in the budget this year, so.
Well, there probably is a few $100,000 of free monies this year that won't, you know, that'll absolutely be left, that if you wish to transfer to the risk account, I would suppose you could do that in the spring.
What could be done, in keeping what you talked about, is if there were a balance, and I'm looking at the year-to-date in this account through the payroll distributed today. That line item is 62% spent.
Okay. As a department?
For the department, for the part-time payroll within that department, of a budget of 262,000. And 266,000, I'm sorry. What could be done is a request from the department head to reappropriate funds before this board, which will only come before this board at a later date, for a certain amount for those funds. I mean, that option is there.
I don't know if you can reappropriate payroll.
You can, we've done it.
Well, it's actually, you're actually less spent in that because you're 100% encumbered on your budget. I mean, your regular payroll is fully encumbered.
Regular payroll, but, yeah, but if you.
This
look
comes
at
under part-time payroll?
It's in the part-time payroll.
Oh, I understand. Okay.
And that's what you could do.
So that's 50,
Well,
I got you, 55% spent without, okay.
I mean, the other flaw with doing that is, if you believe the positions are value, obviously, if you just do a one-shot, then a year from now, we have to then add it to the budget to continue it. But,
I warn
anyway,
you,
I'm
the
sorry that
problem,
happened. It
of
was
course,
just one of those weird
is-
things.
Is in a subsequent year, because now, you know, you've created that hole for fiscal 13, potentially.
All right.
And yes, the boss is supposed to know about hires before they're consummated, but that's another story.
All right. Questions, comments, concerns, motions on this budget?
I apologize. I obviously understand the 40,000-foot question here, but it sounds like there's a couple of options we have. Could someone, I see Paul nodding, summarize for us what are, one option obviously would be just not to vote for it, that goes without saying, but what other options do we have on the table? Could you summarize what we could do to address this problem?
I think your options are, and when the Board of Selectmen acted on this on Tuesday, I'd have to say that we didn't have full information that the position had in fact been filled. And so there is a person actively fulfilling these duties at this time, and that happened a couple of weeks ago, and I think what the First Selectman is asked to restore the cut, or most of the cut, that the selectmen brought forward on Tuesday by the $30,000 figure. That's one option, to restore that, or a portion of that. The remaining option would remain, and that's at the discretion of this board at a later date, would be to reappropriate funds from the current year's budget into next year's budget.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Mr. Tetra?
Just to be clear, if at a later date we reappropriate that money, then there's no impact on the projected tax rate or proposed tax rate that we're approving tonight.
That's correct. The only place would be is it would appear that there's going to be funds left in this budget on that line.
Yep. But if we're going to reappropriate money later in the year, we could potentially reappropriate from any line in the current budget that had surplus. So if for some reason this line didn't have that much, or didn't have as much as we chose, we could reappropriate some from this line and say some from
I
contingency
would
to
add
pick.
this, it's unusual for it to be done particularly for payroll costs. Normally, if there's a project or a piece of equipment or something like that which hasn't been purchased, that's when the departments might.
When you say unusual, do you mean like illegal or just
No,
unusual?
I don't think it's illegal. No, I think it's.
But if I could clarify,
would
you
our-
can only if I could, I believe legally, we can only reappropriate from a budget line that has money. We can't
That's
take
correct.
from
And-
another
and assuming-
department to appropriate to this
And
department.
assuming that the overall
You can
department
transfer during the
still
year,
has-
but you can't roll from one year to another, from a different department to a different department. You
Okay.
follow what I'm saying?
Yep.
So if there's money left here, you can use it, roll it over for this purpose.
So the
You can't
limitation,
take it from the police department in
Would-
June and move it in this department for next June. If you,
yep. So the limitation
right? Am I right about that? I think I'm right about that, right? Yeah.
So the limitation would be from this line item or from this department? This line item may be the only one in the department that has any money left at the end of the year.
It would normally be the line item, right, Paul?
I would, on quick look, I would say the department is going to have some funds left within.
Okay.
But
So
normally you can
roughly-
only reappropriate from each line that has money, not from other lines.
That's right, you've got to.
So
From the line item, as long as there's overall.
So to keep
funds
it,
within the department.
so to keep it simple, since we basically hired this person for the last 25% of the year,
That's correct.
we could potentially reappropriate roughly 75% of the dollars that were budgeted for this year in the next year. So we may not restore the entire position, but we'd restore 75% of it.
Right.
And that, we would know that before June 30th. And so the department head would know that, so this person potentially could continue to work at least 75% of what was anticipated. Is that correct?
Or again, consider funding half of it, or a third of it, or a quarter of it, and at least try to figure it out. But- So it's one of those anomalies that just, Personnel Director was out this week, so the personnel form was still sitting on her desk. I didn't realize it had gotten that far. I did give the sign-off to go ahead 4 months ago, but again, I didn't realize they had consummated it.
Any other questions, comments, or motions from the board on this item? Seeing none, the budget is before us for Human and Social Services as stands from the Board of Selectmen. All in favor of this budget? Opposed? Abstentions? The budget carries. Thank you.
Mr. Chair?
Yes,
Um,
Mr. Tetra?
Can we make a note that Mr. Hiller remind us at some point prior to June 30th when it's appropriate to consider that reappropriation?
Probably at the June meeting.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Hiller. Mr. Flater, we were doing so well on time, too. Solid Waste and Recycling, page number 212 is now before us. Questions, comments, concerns from board members? Any adjustments to this budget? Seeing none, all in favor of this budget? Opposed? Abstentions? That budget carries. Okay, we're into Culture and Recreation section of our budget, and the library budget is now before us. Do you have any motions, Mrs. Leclerc, on the library budget?
I know this is a little bit painful, but because this is a larger budget, I'm going to make a motion to reduce the library materials and supplies by $10,000. It still gives them a little bit more than last year. I know it's a little bit painful, but I'm going to make that motion.
Say the line number.
56,180.
56,180.
By $10,000. Do we have a second to that motion? Mr. DeWitt seconds that. Do we have any questions, comments, concerns on the motion? Seeing none, the motion is now before us. All in favor of Mrs. Leclerc's motion to reduce by $10,000, special department line? Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, the budget as amended and now before us. Mrs. Gardner, I have $4,291,909 now before us. Is that correct? Thank you. Okay, questions, comments, concerns on the budget? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? That budget carries as amended. Okay, the Penfield Pavilion Complex is now before us. Questions, comments, concerns on this budget? Motions? Seeing none, all in favor of this budget? Opposed? Abstentions? Budget carries. Parks and Recreation budget, page 223, is now before us. Was this adjusted at all by the Board of Selectmen, Mrs. Gardner? I just want to be sure. Okay, no adjustment by the Board of Selectmen. So the number before us is 863,488. Questions, comments, concerns on this budget? Seeing none, all in favor of this budget? Opposed? Abstentions? That budget carries. We now have the waterfront and the marina before us, page 227, waterfront marina. Any questions, comments, concerns on this budget? Seeing none, motions? None, all in favor? Opposed, abstentions, that budget carries. Okay, we now have the South Pine Creek Golf Course before us, page 229. That's South Pine Creek Golf Course. Questions, comments, concerns, motions on this budget? Okay, seeing none, all in favor of this budget? Opposed, abstentions, that budget carries. And now we have the H. Smith Richardson Golf Course before us. Questions, comments, concerns? Mr. Brown?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to reduce the capital outlay by $19,240, which is the utility vehicle.
The heavy-duty utility vehicle, $19,240. Do I have a second to that motion? Mr. DeWitt, any questions, comments, concerns on that motion? Mr. Tetra?
Mr. Chair, do we know what was included in the $98,000 adjustment that the Board of Selectmen made, just to make sure we're not double counting or anything here?
Just the bunker renovation, Mr. Tetra?
Okay.
Thank you, Mrs. Gardner. Mr. Flato?
I just did want to point out to the board, though, that there was a slight additional, if I remember correctly, leftover reduction that was to be determined by the Golf Commission beyond that piece of equipment that we cut, in the amount of, how much?
There was, Mr. Lombardo may be able to address it.
I'll figure it out for you, just hang on one second.
Okay, so there was another adjustment in here. Okay.
So in other words, in capital, there was another amount that had already been reduced that hadn't been enumerated as to which item. So I just didn't want you to think there wasn't something else they had to reduce.
Mr. DeWitt?
Is, on the capital for H. Smith Richardson, are we still at TBD by commission?
Right, that's what I'm saying. There was, let's see.
Oh, that's what you're saying, they've
Right.
quantified some of those
Out of the
numbers?
247, there was 100 for the biorack, there was 25 for the aerifier, that's one, right, Linda, 125.
You reduced those to zero in the original proposal.
Right, but that's part of the two.
original, it got down to 142,000. I don't have,
Another 7,400 was cut off by the,
So that you need to cut, because Jerry is going to fund the pickup truck and the, 2 of the 3 fairway mowers. And with
Funded,
7,400
huh?
left over, he really can't
Funded in this year's budget?
in this capital.
in the next year's budget. So, Mr. Brown, can you adjust your motion to reduce it by another $7,400, please?
But I'm not, Linda, if I could just clarify,
Residual amount.
how much currently is left after this motion?
And then the 99,000.
I thought we figured this out.
Right? Wait, no, I'm sorry. If you take out your
Jerry, wasn't-
19,240.
there were 3 pieces.
No, just tell me how much is left, and I could explain what they have to choose from.
Okay. What was left after your?
No. What's the amount of capital without their cut?
99,000
Mr. Flato, can you speak
It's
up a little
left.
bit
for the
there?
fairway mowers, plus Mr. Brown has asked to reduce the $19,240 for the heavy-duty utility vehicle. What also, I believe, was the triplex green mower? Is that?
Well, you're missing what I'm saying. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to belabor. The amount that the Board of Selectmen voted on was how much in capital?
The amount that you voted on was,
What's left?
right, 149,640.
So what I was trying to say was, out of the 149, they've got,
There was,
if you look at the items that were left in there, that they could, in effect, decide, there was 99,000 that I had agreed to, but then there was another 50,000 of all the other things that they had left.
Yep.
So all I'm saying is if you do another 19,000, that only leaves 31,000 of stuff left out of the pickup truck, the heavy-duty vehicle, the mass auto reel grinder, the triplex green mower, and the green aerifier. And the grinder. So there are 6 items.
God bless you.
Thank you.
In other words, there's 6 items. It's not just one that would go, is what I'm saying.
Right, but Mr.
As long as you understand that.
Mr. Brown, you were specifically addressing the amount in there for the utility vehicle, correct?
Right.
Correct.
Okay. But Jim, all I'm saying is they'll have to cut more than just the utility vehicle of the remaining things, as long as you're aware of that, that's all.
Yep.
You follow what I'm saying?
If I may?
Because it's TBD by commission?
Correct, because we've already,
Because those numbers are ceiling.
Because it didn't add up.
You gave them
a kind of a blank.
You gave them a ceiling, because
Right.
during the thing, you said it could be up to, it would be some number less than the number approved.
Right. So I just want to make you aware that there were other things they'll have to cut beyond that, as opposed to if you didn't make this cut, this could be one of the things they would cut as part of the cut they have to make. You follow what I'm saying?
No.
No.
Okay.
If I may, if I understand it correctly, the first selectman gave us $247,640 to start with.
Right.
We took $100,000 out the other evening
For the bunkers.
for the bond
98.
issue.
98.
Right. So
Okay.
so that leaves about 150.
Okay.
That left you
So what we're asking for this evening, or what we asked for the other night, is the $24,000 for the truck, the 2 mowers, and you just deleted, or you will be deleting, the 19,000. So we would be asking for $123,000, and that would get us through next year.
that's correct.
Thank you very much.
That
No,
ties
we
in-
put our things in order of priority.
Okay.
I
So
just
to
wanna
to
make
reach
sure-
that number,
Okay.
we're satisfied with that.
Thank you very
All
much.
right, well, that's what we needed to hear. I thought that they were.
Yes.
We were trying to stay within your 247.
No, he wants to cut the 19.5. The motion stands, yes. Motion stands.
The math works.
The math works.
And do we have the revised department total at this point, or am I asking too soon?
You're asking it a little bit too soon. Let me get a second for the motion. Can we have a second for Mr. Brown's motion?
I think I
Mr.
already-
DeWitt seconded it. Thank you. Can we just check the departmental total, and we'll wait to vote on this motion, just to make sure we have the right departmental total.
I guess I'm confused. Didn't Mr. Lombardo say there was more of a cut to take than what Mr.?
You're going to open this can of worms again?
I'm just saying, it should. I was going to say, yeah, he did man up.
The new department total is 1,000,000.
Please speak up, Mrs. Gardner, I'm sorry. Thank you.
1,639,584.
1,639,584. Okay, 1,639,584. And the motion is now before us to reduce, that's after it's been reduced by 19,240, correct? That's the motion before us.
Correct.
Questions, comments, concerns on the motion? Yes, Mr. Stone?
What's the percentage? Can you do that real fast?
Increase over last
Oh.
year.
Percent of the reduction?
No,
Mr. Chair, we're just voting on the amendment.
yeah,
We're just voting on the amendment.
fine, but that's what I want later.
Okay. All in favor of the amendment? Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, the budget as amended is now before us, 1,639,584. Questions, comments, concerns?
I just want the percentage.
Percentage increase year over year
Yeah,
Yeah,
on the adjusted amount?
10.8.
okay.
Okay. Questions, comments, concerns on this? Seeing none, all in favor of the budget as it stands before us? Opposed? Abstentions? Mr. Stone is the opposition on that. And then we're done with the golf course. Now, we did the Board of Education. Let's go to debt service, okay? And then we'll do retiree benefits, human resources. I think we do Water Pollution Control Authority separately, do we not? Okay. So debt service is now before us, page 249. Questions, comments, concerns on debt service?
871.
Seeing none. All in favor of the debt service budget? Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, so debt service carried unanimously. We're now on human resources, including retiree benefits. Let's go to retiree benefits first. That's page 245 of our budget book. 245. There was retiree benefits. Questions, comments, concerns? I believe, Mr. Flato, did we have an adjustment to this at the Board of Selectmen
yes.
level?
Well, what our board did, Mr. Chairman, was, if you remember when we went through the public hearing on that, we realized that the OPEB amount that we had funded was higher in the proposal than we had realized with the actuarial number and everything. It was around 92% or something like that of funding. And so what we looked at was, well, what would be the comparable amount year per year to have a similar amount this year and a similar amount next year to fully fund? And it turned out that we were in effect over budgeting by about 150 the amount. We were adding more this year than next year, and in effect funding it accelerated, and the 150 levels it off pretty much between the 2 years as to the amount that's needed per year. So that was why the adjustment was made.
Okay, so what's the number that's now before us, Mrs. Garner?
The budget has been reduced
By 150,000.
by 150,000.
926,306.
And the increase,
926,306, thank you.
so the increase from this year to next year would be how much? Just to give you a sense of what next year is.
Increase would be 2,630,000.
2,630,000. And Ms.
No.
422, yeah, that's,
Oh, that's with the pension, but I'm just talking about the OPEB.
Oh, with the pension, yeah.
Right,
That-
so the OPEB part's around 750 or something like that? And I believe there was about 1,000,003 left in total to the ARC, so it leaves about 650 or something like that for next year.
and Mr. Flato, if I can recall this, the 150 that you moved from here went to the internal service fund, correct?
We ended up upping amounts in the risk management, internal service, and workman's comp, yeah.
Thank you. Questions, comments from board members on this adjustment? And the budget now stands before us at $10,926,306. Seeing no questions, comments, concerns, all in favor of this budget? Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, that budget carries. That budget is done. Okay, now before us is the Human Resources Department budget, which also includes our funding of our insurance amounts. Page 67, thank you, Mr. DeWitt. And Mr. Tetra, that's not Roman numeral 67, that is the regular 67. All right. Budget is now before us. Do I have any adjustments? Yes, Mr. Brown.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, on line item 58930, heart and hypertension.
Heart and hypertension?
I'd like to increase this line item by $57,000 to take the number to $652,000 from 595, and that's based on the recommendation from our independent advisor, PMA.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown's amendment is to line item 58930. That's our heart and hypertension account. The amount in the amendment is $57,000 to raise that budget line to $652,000. And do I have a second to that, Mr. Bolito? Do I have any questions, comments, concerns on this adjustment? Seeing none, that motion is now before us. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? We have 2 abstentions. Motion carries. Okay. Any other motions related to this? Mrs. Leclerc?
Okay, I'd like to make a motion to amend line item 53410, claims handling service charge, and reduce that by $11,000.
$11,000 reduction, claims handling service charge to 53,410. So that motion is now before us. Do we have a second? Mr. DeWitt, do we have any questions, comments, concerns on this motion? Mr. Stone?
The reason for your reduction?
Because it's the claims handling, so it's that fee that they charge, I think, the service charge.
Okay, I have in my notes, Mr. Stone, that this was the fee related to workers' comp, and that the fee was much larger this year, given the fact that our projection is for it to be at about $300,000 to $400,000 over where it is coming in for next year, where it's budgeted to come in. That's what I have in my notes, Mrs. Leclerc, is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Questions, comments, concerns on this? Seeing none. All in favor of this motion? Opposed? Abstentions? That motion carries. At this point, do we have any other questions, comments, concerns on the human resources budget, with the exception of the risk management fund, the workers' comp fund, and there's a new line item that was put in by the Board of Selectmen, the medical cost related to the internal service fund, correct? That's all within this. So are there any other adjustments not related to those funds? Okay. Seeing none, Mrs. Gardner, can you do a tally of the adjustments that we've done to the budget so far this evening?
To this human resource budget?
No,
or
to the entire budget.
Okay, give me 1 second.
Sure. Actually, why don't we take a 5-minute break and let Mrs. Gardner do the tallying on this, and if we could come back after a 5-minute recess. Thank you. Excuse me, can the meeting come back to order, please? Everyone, can the meeting come back to order, please?
Ready for your number?
Ready for my number. At first, before I go to the number, I realize that in my opening comments tonight, I thanked a lot of people and boards for all their hard work. At the last meeting, I did thank the Board of Education, but I forgot to thank them again this evening, and I don't want them to feel slighted. They did do their own budget process. Yeah, they did their budget process earlier in January, and they put a lot of hard work and effort into it, along with Dr. Title and his administration. So I do want to make sure, and I know we do have at least one member of our Board of Education here, that they recognize and we appreciate their efforts, and we thank them as well, along with everybody else. Again, we said it last meeting, but I did thank a bunch of people at the beginning of this meeting and did not want them to be left out. With that in mind, Mrs. Gardner, or without that in mind, Mrs. Gardner, can you please give us the numbers?
Okay, so far you have cut from the budget $196,985.
Okay, 196,995.
985.
985. I was trying to pick up an extra 10 bucks. Okay. 196,985. We have reduced the budget by. Okay. I have my own motion to make, and 190. Okay, and that takes into account the 57,000 for heart and hypertension, correct?
Yes, and the 11,000 reduction in claims handling.
And the $11,000 reduction. Okay, so it's 196,985. Can I make a motion that we add I'm going to, $50,000 to the workers' comp expense, so we bring that to a total of $2 million, which is closer to what we're running per estimates of this year. And based,
By the Board of Selectmen as well, right?
it was changed by the Board of Selectmen. I'm adding $50,000 more to bring that up to an even $2 million. And I want to take a $140,000 more and put that into the medical cost internal service fund line. So my total adjustment is $190,000. The intent of the adjustment is all of this to go directly into the internal service fund, $140,000 towards the medical cost internal service fund, and $50,000 towards workers' comp. As everyone knows, these are our two, this has been our problem area. This has been our biggest concern of this budget season, and we need to rectify this issue for our town and for our long-term financial stability. Is there a second to my motion? Mr. Tetro seconds my motion. Any questions, comments, concerns on this? Any other adjustments to my motion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion to increase workers' comp by $50,000 and medical cost internal service fund by $140,000. All in favor? Opposed? Abstention? The motion carries unanimously. So we have increased that fund. And that is it for the expense side of the budget.
I have a question.
Want to vote on the whole budget?
Hold on,
We
I
ha-
gotta give you your number.
Time out. I want to vote on revenue, right?
You wanna vote on
We got to do on a,
HR budget.
The
oh,
adjusted
you're
HR
right,
budget.
I'm sorry.
Okay,
Thank you.
no problem.
I just-
Give me the adjusted number.
I think you're just in, hold on, I just wanna make sure I.
See, you guys keep me, I was right to thank you guys earlier. You keep me in line.
Do we need to do any type of vote to facilitate
It's an honor and a privilege,
these monies to the internal service fund? I don't know.
Let's not push
and
it.
it keeps me off.
We just put them through expense.
Hang on, let me just.
Come on, Deb, you got the job.
Deb, you be sleeping. You be sleeping already, Deb, come on.
Oh, so it's going through the. So there's no need to make any, okay.
That's why I did it that way.
Yep, I got it, thanks.
And we said we give it out, so that line should be zero next year, because everything else should be right within the department. We're taking care of the other
Ready?
others. Please.
Wait a minute, you gotta give yourself a.
5,706,669.
669. Okay, so the human resources budget before us right now is funded at 5,706,669. Questions, comments, concerns on this budget?
The Board of Selectmen adjusted it by 800.
Okay. Seeing none,
Slightly different.
all in favor of the human resources budget?
This one, the Board of.
Opposed? Abstentions? That budget carries unanimously. Okay, so we're done with the expense side of the budget now. Correct? I think we should go do revenue, and then we'll do the Water Pollution Control Authority. How's that? Okay? So, the revenue budget, let's go to, those pages are
Oh, yeah.
Start on page 14. Page
page
14.
page 14. Thank you, Mr. Hiller. Thank
Excuse
you
me,
very
you
much.
have to vote on the operating budget in total?
We will. Thank you.
Before revenue, in other words, it's a separate vote from the revenue.
Separate vote for revenue and expense. We'll come back and do that. Let's make sure we have the revenue down, so we know exactly what we're doing. Thank you, Mr. Flato. Okay, any questions, comments, adjustments to revenue? Mr. Brockfeld?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to look at, you know what, I apologize. I am lost in, I know what I want to recommend, but I have lost myself on the line number.
1084?
Thank you so much. Line 1084, the 44001, the investment line, I'd like to recommend that we reduce that by $100,000 and do $1 million rather than the 1.1. I think that given the run rate that we've seen from Mr. Hiller, that even at that level, we're probably taking on a little bit of risk, but I think it's reasonable in light of the economy and some of the agreements we've discussed with the First Selectman going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Brockfeld. Do we have a second to that
I'll
motion?
second that.
Interest in dividends?
Yes, it was. We have Mr. Kiley with the second. Line item motion before us now is 01084, 44001, which is interest and dividends. The estimated amount was $1,100,000. Mr. Brockfeld is reducing that by $100,000 by this motion, which would be even with the 2011 year estimate. Any questions, comments, concerns on his motion? Mr. Kiley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mrs. Gardner, Mr. Hiller, I just wanted to bring us back to a conversation we had the night we talked about this item. I would like to recommend that we view this account differently going forward. I would like to see the total investment income, the gross investment income on a revenue line, and somewhere else in the budget, I would like to see an expense line that shows the bank charges and fees and other such items that are netted out of the bank statements each month, because right now, we're only reporting this as a net number. And I just have no visibility on either what the real revenue is or what the expense against the revenue is on the bank statement. So if we could agree on that format, that would get me comfortable, and I think it would have us on track for better budgeting and analysis.
Thank you, Mr. Kiley. Any other questions, comments, concerns on this item? Seeing none, all in favor of Mr. Brockfeld's motion to cut this line item by $100,000? Opposed, abstentions, motion carries unanimously. That line item has now been reduced to $1 million. And now let's continue to look at revenue. Any other questions, comments, concerns on revenue lines at this point? Any motions? Seeing none, all in favor of accepting revenue for the town?
Mr. Chairman?
Yep.
I just, there's two small adjustments
the amounts.
that I'd like to recommend as a result of new information that we have as far as this. One is on the
Speak up, please, and
One is on the phone access line budget, which is under general property taxes.
What page?
Page 14 at the top.
Okay.
Originally estimated at 163,552.
What's the line item?
Line item 40040, last one in that. property.
4004, got it, thanks.
We've received information from the, and what we've done historically on this line is taken what, and unfortunately, we've been off every year because it's been declining. But the reduction that we're going to receive this year, as brought forward by the Office of Policy and Management, is to reduce that line by $24,579, which we don't know what we're going to get next year, but we know we're not going to get 163 this year, and that number is going to be down.
So it's 24, what's the adjustment?
Reduction of $24,579.
Okay. Mr. Tetra?
Mr. Hiller, could you be explicit about what you mean by this year and next year? Could we use fiscal year numbers so we're clear on?
Well, what we've historically done on this, we received, as you can see, last year, 163,552, and we've carried that forward. We know we're only going to, we will receive.
When you say last year,
I'm sorry?
when you say last year, what fiscal
10.
year are you?
Fiscal 10.
Okay.
In fiscal 11, we budgeted that same number because we had, we don't get this we got this information within the last 2 or 3 weeks, which
Okay.
is earlier by about 2 weeks than we have previously. We now know that what we're going to get for fiscal 11 this year is going to be $24,579 less than that. So this number has been declining steadily over many, many years, over the last half a dozen years. What we've done, just to bring it into line, is to reduce it to the fiscal 11 number, carrying that forward. We don't know. I mean, I think we've seen the worst in this, because this line used to be over $500,000 of revenue.
All right. And Mr. Heller, when you say we've adjusted it. Did the Board of Selectmen adjust it? Are you suggesting we make the
This
adjustment?
board has, because we've taken, Board of Selectmen did nothing with the revenue adjustments. It did no revenue adjustments.
Okay, so you're suggesting this board make that adjustment then?
Yes, I am.
Any other adjustments, Mr. Hiller? You said you had two.
So I had one other one on line
Okay.
48202, which is on page 15, under state grants other than education, nitrogen removal. We had estimated 50,000.
Oh, there it is. Yeah, nitrogen.
Where is it?
Two-thirds of the way down, in the middle of the state grants other than education, nitrogen removal credit. This one, there's a little bit of a lag on. I would increase that budget by $11,360. This credit is paid on a calendar year basis. We'll receive these funds normally in August. It's based on, frankly, a very successful year as far as nitrogen removal, as monitored by our Water Pollution Control Authority and administered by the Department of Environmental Protection.
Okay. I saw Mr. Brockfeld had his hand up. Mr. Brockfeld, I know it relates to the other item,
Yeah,
but
go ahead.
go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hiller, just going back to the 440 line that you discussed a second ago.
Yes.
I know none of us like surprise revenue reductions, and I'm sure you don't like being the bearer of the news. But if this line is trending down,
Yes.
and we got a $25,000 reduction last year that we didn't expect or budget for, why would we budget for the exact same amount this year? Why wouldn't we
I think
anticipate
that's a
it?
good question. And there are efforts in the General Assembly, and as you're well aware, there's a lot of lines here that are up for debate in the General Assembly, and this is one of them as to how we handle it. This basically is a personal property tax. 95% of this is on AT&T. We have some other smaller carriers in the town on the equipment. Because of the digital age, they're using less equipment, and this is really what this is. There's efforts to put this stuff into a personal property tax, and that's legislation that's pending before the General Assembly. Frankly, I'd rather see, because we have no way to predict this. And I think your point is, it has declined. This $24,000 decline is probably the least decline that we've seen over the last half a dozen years. We have seen over $100,000 declines in this line in years past.
Mr. Chairman, I guess that on one hand, the good news is at 163,000, we're unlikely to see a $100,000 decline for more than 1 year in a row. But I guess, without getting too technical, because I'm sure neither of us can answer this question, AT&T obviously is reducing their landline and all that kind of stuff. I assume that's what you're talking about. At the same time, they're in this business with the, I apologize, I don't remember the name of it because I don't have it where I live, but the, some kind of fancy digital cable. Not Fios, that's the other one. I'm sorry. UVerse, right, UVerse. Do you have any idea whether or not the tax, because that's a growing business?
That's a growing business,
Right.
and part of that, I think there's two things. Part of that is from the assessors in the personal property tax. There's also you talk AT&T and Vios and Verizon and Cablevision. As you're aware, and this was the first year, we received money for this cable access line, and it's very difficult to estimate that because we only have 1 year's experience on that, and so we've been, I think, conservative as far as that number is concerned.
So, and
That number, I know, is capped also within the state.
So is it fair to say, when we trying to figure out what's the appropriate number here, because I'm a little confused, that we should not consider the UVerse as part of the potential helping, offsetting the reduction?
Yeah, I think again, one of your problems there, that would relate, a lot of that stuff, if it came in and would relate to the grand list of this coming October. the October 11
I
grand list,
got
which
you.
relates to
Okay.
fiscal 13.
Okay.
Go ahead, Mr. Kiley.
Thank you. Mr. Brockfield, I have a follow-up because I had the similar question that you had. And I don't know what makes sense historically or how this may trend, downward or upward, faster or slower from last year. But straight math, if we received 163,000 in 2010, and we know we're going to receive the 139,000 this year, that's now known to us, that's a 15% reduction. And if you were to follow that pattern, if that were to be accurate, then a 15% reduction off this year's 139 would take it to 118. Just, continuing that trend for what that trend is worth.
Which would be as good a guess as any.
I
I mean,
would,
it's the most logical guess, I should say.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, okay.
Any
I
other,
guess even if you look on that line on the budget line, the prior year from 2009 to 2010, it went down by 70,000.
not helping your case.
Yeah. It's like, we're leaning towards something,
Yeah,
but okay,
exactly.
70,000.
That's why I qualified my answer.
Yeah.
Do we have any motions?
I'd like to make a motion.
Yes.
I'd like to amend 40040 down to, Mr. Kiley, could you help me with the math?
118K.
To 118,000 from 163,552.
And that,
based on the-
reduction is an amount of
Yeah,
45,552.
45,552, Mr. Brockfield?
45,552, yes.
Okay, do you want to finish up with the other line item?
I had no,
No, you want to do the nitrogen, or do you just want to go down?
I had nothing to say on the nitrogen.
Okay, do you want to make the motion to go up on it and do it all at one time, or do you know?
Oh, together?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, okay. You know, what, I hit that.
Nitrogen narcosis.
Yeah, that's right. I breathed in some of that nitrogen, and now I've forgotten
It's
yeah.
11,360.
Yes, so I'd like to add to my motion on the nitrogen line, which is 4202, a budget of 5575, which is a
You'd like to increase it by 11,360?
11,360, thank you. I do it with the Mickey Mouse voice, but I'm not going to. Oh, that's helium, I'm sorry, okay, yeah.
Do we have a second to that motion? Mr. Stone. So we have a motion, a combined motion in front of us on the revenue under line item 440, the phone access lines, a reduction to 119,000, which that reduction, help me with the math again, was 45,000?
45,552.
45,552, as well as an increase on the 48202 nitrogen removal credit of 11,360. That motion is now before us. Questions, comments, concerns from board members? Seeing none, all in favor of that motion? Opposed, abstention, motion carries. So now the total revenue is in front of us as adjusted. Mrs. Gardner, if you could give us the figure that we're supposed to vote on in total, Mr. Hiller?
Well, the total revenue is going to be your total expenditures, which is going to adjust.
Right.
Actually, not until we go back and compare. I think, Mr. Chair, I think your point is that we need to know what the total revenues are to see
Yes,
if
we
we need
do.
to make any expense adjustments.
Yes, we do.
So you removed a total of 134, 192.
So we removed a total of how much?
134, 192 off of the 264. So that would leave revenue at 2. You would, that would bring revenue down to 263, 909, 916. What, that doesn't balance the budget?
263, 909,
Okay, wait, all
916.
right, so,
Gotta add the difference
so we have to
into-
add the difference of the 9.
Into the 40,000 line.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. Okay, so your new revenue is actually the difference just of the expenditure number off of it. Okay, so, yeah. Okay, your new number is 264,034,123.
264,034.
123.
Can you check what our expense number is then,
That's
please?
your expense number.
And that's the expense number as well.
Yes.
And,
Go ahead, Mr.
Mr.
Tetchell.
Chair, what's the difference between revenues and expenses at this point? We just got 263 for revenues and 264 for expenses.
264. They balance.
We magically came together?
That's a statutory requirement.
No, but we just add plus and minus to both sides, and we magically came up exactly to the dollar?
The line that would be adjusted by that variance is the current year levy line.
Could we just totaled a bunch of expenses. Could we have that number, and we just totaled a bunch of revenues? Could we have that number and not make any other adjustments until we do?
Your net reduction on the expense side.
Just want the total.
264,034,123.
That's the expenses? Okay, what's the revenue?
034, 1,
Well,
2,
it has
3.
to equal. Before I balance it, all right, fine.
You should be 130. Yeah,
Yeah, it's about $1.25.
yeah. It's got $1.25, right?
Yeah.
$1.28.
263, 906, 916.
906 or 909?
63, 906, 916.
said 909 before, but.
Did I, let me just add that. Let me just.
120, 127, 207.
Yeah, that should be the number.
Right?
Yeah.
263, 906, 916.
Yep, that's the number. That's the number,
I think so.
yeah, because that's the
If I
number
heard
to
her,
be,
if I
yeah.
heard her correctly. Yeah.
So now we need to make a motion to increase the amount raised by taxation, or reduce the expense.
And we can, so we have a couple choices, right?
Yep. Yep.
Now I understand.
Get your checkbook out.
The delta number,
You in essence reduced revenue by 134, 192. And you reduced expenses
It's really what the mill
by
rate's going to
6,985.
yes, Mr.
It's a
Flato.
15K piece.
Just a suggestion as a, you know, as a ex officio member. So basically, there's a net difference of 135,000. If you don't wish to see a mill rate adjustment of 1/100th, which I think is about $200,000, roughly, a .01 mill rate change is how much?
It's actually, the adjustment is 128.
127,
approximately
What is it?
108,000. 108,000.
Yeah, that's what I got.
Is 1/100th?
108,
127.
207.
108,000 is
Okay.
1 mil.
Okay, I thought-
1/100th of a mil,
Okay, I thought it was 200, okay.
yeah.
So it's approximately a 1/100th of a mil change, or it could be a slight change in the collection assumption, you know, which we've budgeted usually a bit below what we've actually received per year. And you won't make those final decisions until your, you know, meeting after the budget is set. So my own personal suggestion would be to have Mr. Hiller leave the mill rate going in as it's reflected, look at the uncollecteds, look at the collection rate, and then wait to see what the RTM does.
I think that's a calculation that really is a calculation for May 3rd, frankly, when we see what the RTM has done. I mean, there will be an estimated mill rate based on, first off, on the list, the assessor's grand list after that.
Right.
Also, an estimate as to what the Board of Assessment Appeals is going to do.
Right.
Mr. Brown and I have been in discussion on that and trying to figure
But
out a number.
but they have to have a revenue number for the property line in this budget statement for the
And
paper.
again, that adjustment, which we will have final prior to May 3rd by the Board of Assessment Appeals action, will be the decision of this board on May 3rd.
Right.
But my point is, you'd have to reflect another 100 and whatever thousand in that revenue line,
127, 207.
in that property tax line.
Right.
The question
To
is,
the property
reduce
tax line.
expense.
question is it a mill impact? Is it an adjustment in the senior tax relief estimate? Is it an adjustment in the collection rate? You know, there are all those, you know, does the motor vehicle number end up in the end being better? There's all those factors. that you would then look at so I guess the question is, what do you want to reflect in the paper as the projected mill rate? Do you want to revise it by 1/100th or not? Or do you want to make, or do you want to relook at anything, that you've looked at?
Go ahead, Mr. Kiley,
just
you
those
have a
thoughts?
question?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Without suggesting we do this by plugging the collection rate for the $127,000 that we're talking about, if we were to add $127,000 to the collections, what would that do to the collections rate?
If you were to add to the collection.
Because that's
If you
what you're...
assume how much would you have to assume the collection rate improved by in order to get
Well
the
over
additional
99%.
127?
Right.
Well, you're already well over 99. I'm looking for
We
a
were.
No, we're at 98.92 right now.
98.92. Yeah, that's right, too.
And that's up from last year at 98.96, or 86.
98.86.
I don't feel good about this. I do have to go find some expenses.
So what is the pleasure of the board?
What's the other option?
Cut expenses?
Mr. Chair, yeah, we need to have something coming out of here tonight. So we either increase the mill rate by, and again, we're not
Could I-
voting on the mill rate, but we're
we've
allowing
never-
Mr. Hiller to put in a proposed mill rate reflective of that difference, or we go back and cut expenses.
Those are the two options.
I would offer that at this meeting, prior to that, we have never offered a proposed mill rate.
In the paper or otherwise?
Well, in the paper, because we've got calculations still to do as far as that, based on the actions tonight, based on the revenue items that you've set. You have delivered essentially right now a balanced budget,
Right.
which is required by statute.
We can't, I'm looking at page 11 of the budget book. We've got proposed mill rates in there. In fact, it's called the 2012 approved mill rate. Now, we know it's not the approved mill rate, so let's call that a typo.
That's a typo.
Okay? But we've got to come out of here with a balance, and we either have to propose a mill rate or cut the expenses, or potentially go back and increase revenues.
One thing that I would add on that, Mr. Tetro, is that the proposed mill rate was based on on several various assumptions, which we said at the beginning of this process. The major one, which has varied since that time, is a greater reduction in the grand list by to the final assessor's grand list. We had numbers within that were increased by the reval firm after the informal hearings. We anticipate, frankly, that there will be other reductions as a result of the Board of Assessment Appeals action.
Right, but it's still, by midnight tonight, as of right now, there are certain assumptions and certain numbers we're basing all this on, much like we did at the start of this on page 11, where we put in a bunch of assumptions that we have expense budgets in here that we hadn't approved yet, and we've significantly modified. We have a revenue assumptions in here that weren't approved yet, but we significantly modified. So all we're trying to do is true up to where we are right now, not saying that it won't change between now and Cinco de Mayo, just saying that we need to have something that we can pass off to the RTM that balances.
We can, and we've done those calculations internally based upon, targets that we've set, but not an exact number, because we've got to recalculate
Yeah.
based upon
Mr. Hiller.
two major variances.
Yeah, no, I think, Mr. Tetra, if I might. I think the question comes down to this. We obviously don't set the mill rate for the town until after the RTM's actions in May, right?
Correct.
Okay. But it is incumbent upon us to forward through this process and recommend a balanced budget. Correct?
Correct. You
When-
recommended an expense budget based upon certain numbers.
Okay. What goes into the newspaper as a recommendation of this board within the next few days? Does a mill rate go into that?
That's what I just asked Linda.
Yes.
Yes, it does.
Right. So the point stands, that we need to decide what mill rate we want reflected. And the way I look at it, there's three ways that we get there. Number one, the 127, either we add that to taxes, and we say either that's going to be made up by an increase in mill rate, or it's going to be made up by an increase in collections rate. Now, there's all sorts of other factors that go into that, but we can't control any of them, and you're not going to recalculate them here tonight, right? And by the way, if you recalculate them, they're going to be different in 30 days when we set it anyway.
Well, after the RTM actions, or
Exactly. Okay? Or we can try to reduce expenses further than what we've already done here tonight, so that we don't have to adjust any of the revenue items. Correct?
you always have that option tonight.
Right. Okay.
If I could just ask this may help clear this, because I'm not sure the number. Can we just calculate to make sure we know what, we have a 98.92% collection rate assumed, right? Or
First Selectman's recommendation back in.
the fiscal office recommendation, but okay.
Was based upon a collection rate of 98.92.
Okay, so, wait, no, stop right there. So, there's about a $4 billion grant list, roughly?
For
The grant list total is, how much?
10 billion 8.
Okay, so, what I was trying to get at is, a 1/100th change in that is 1/10,000th of the grant list, which is $100,000.
Go ahead, yes.
So going from 98.92 to 98.93 is a $100,000 increase, correct?
However, and here's the big however.
Paul, I'm just asking, a 1/100th change?
Yes, roughly. Yes.
So to go to 99%, that's an $800,000 increase.
Except the major exception, and it is major, that figure was based, the figure.
I understand the assessors making, I understand that, but you just said it's an $80,000 increase to go from 98.92 to 99. It's an $800,000 increase in collections, not 80, I think. That's what I'm asking.
What I thought your question was, what is 100th of a mill, which I said was 108,000.
No, what I was trying to figure out is, if the collection rate is only 1/100th and we're at 98.93, that's not a big deal because we've been collecting over 99%. If it brings us over 99%, 100,000, that is a big deal. So I'm just trying to find out what the right calculation is. You follow what I'm saying?
Calculation first, you've got.
I'm sorry, I'm just.
No, you've got two different numbers.
Right, there's $10 billion mill rate, of grant list.
Yeah, and a 100th of a mill.
No, forget the mill. If the collection rate changes from 98.92 to 98.93, can you guys calculate what that change would be in?
Roughly, well,
Yes, wanna make-
you're estimating.
It's just a decimal point, I just can't figure it out in my head.
The estimate.
Because, this will affect your equation here, I think. Sorry to take the time,
We had estimated that we would take in, for current year levy, 237 million. Let's talk in that figure, as far as a rough figure. That number, as of this evening, by the actions, as for several different actions, has changed fractionally. So you've got to look at, a 0.1% of 237 million. What are you looking at there?
It's 0.5% to make up
Yeah,
100,000.
So 0.1%, you're getting into the $240,000 category to move this.
Right, but it's a half of a change in a mill to get to the $100,000.
Half, yeah.
Right, so it's
yeah.
not a full mill, so the mill is not changing by more than
Are you done?
1/100th. 1/100th is a $240,000 change.
Correct.
Okay, so I guess what I'm trying to get at is your net change may not be enough to affect the mill one way or the other,
Actually, I got Mike.
unless, and if the collection rate has that much slack in it. You follow what I'm trying to get at?
I know what you're trying to get at. I'm not sure that he's giving you the right calculation to get there.
Well, that's why, Paul, without having the
Right.
calculator, I don't have one.
Mr. Tetra?
I was trying to figure out, ask you to calculate it if.
Mr. Chair, if I might suggest for our board, for suggestion for discussion, I'm very uncomfortable with, first of all, back-of-the-envelope math, but second, discussing one of the components of this calculation that we haven't had any data presented to us, haven't discussed, haven't had any presentation on. It seems to me we've got two options before us. One is further expense cuts. We've had some pretty extensive discussions on the expenses, so we should be well-versed in dealing with that if we choose, or making a change in the proposed mill rate. It would be a small change, and would go to the RTM, letting them know what would happen if they, in fact, don't change the expenses as we send them to them. So I think that we really want to explore either of those two options before looking too far outside of that.
Thank you, Mr. Tetra. Mr. Brockfeld?
Actually, I was going to say virtually the same thing. I just don't like, I think that we've worked very hard, and we've had a wonderful cooperative effort on the revenues and the expenses, and we've come up with numbers, and those numbers represent a shortfall of approximately $125,000.
Yep.
And it's not acceptable to me to simply say, oh, well, we're 125 short, we'll just change some assumption, and therefore we're there. We
Yep.
could then plug a hole of $500,000 to get there, too. So I would recommend that, just to echo Mr. Tetro, that we either bury our heads back in the book and potentially find another $125,000 of cuts, or just accept that that's the result of our efforts, and the tax rate will be a very small amount higher than we would prefer. And I can live with either of those, by the way.
Thank you, Mr. Brockfeld. Any other questions, comments, concerns from board members? Okay. Do we have any motions from board members, either on revenue or expenses at this point? Mr. Tetra?
Mr. Chair, just a point of information or order. How do we, if I were going to recommend that we instruct Mr. Hiller to raise the projected mill rate by .01, does that get us all the way we need to? And is that the motion we would make at this point?
Mr. Hiller, the question would be, how do you calculate the amount being 127,000, help me out, 725? 7,207, thank you. How do we calculate the amount, the exact amount of the mill rate adjustment to get there if the desire was to just increase the?
There are half a dozen components into the formula, led off by one. The first two are the grand list as it has been approved now by the assessor and been submitted by the assessor.
Is that different than the grand list that is in this book?
Yes. Because there was.
So so if we weren't having this discussion, let me change it. If we were not having this discussion right now, what mill rate would you print in the newspaper?
We haven't done that calculation. And we've never at this meeting done that calculation before,
But yet we print it in the newspaper.
based upon the balanced budget that you have delivered.
Tom?
Yeah.
May I? Maybe I'm not versed in the procedure here, but it's the way I see it. I think we've approved a group of expenses and a group of revenues, and we're handing that over to our fiscal officer to use those two numbers, which don't match exactly, and by definition, since we're not giving any other instructions, he will calculate I assume it's an estimated mill rate at this point, that would satisfy the requirement to have a balanced budget. I don't
It's
really
an estimated mill rate because the one number unknown at this time, well, two numbers unknown, and one number won't be known at the time when the RTM passes this budget, and that is the final amount of the senior tax relief. That number is unknown, and will be unknown even when you pass a budget. So there's risk there.
So again, would,
As an example, I can tell you this right now, that
Mr. Hill, I think we get it, but forgive me for cutting you off, but I think we understand it, and I think I understand what Mr. Brockfeld's saying. What I want to make sure is that whatever's noticed in the paper is appropriately footnoted, that says, here's the revenue and the expenses that have been approved by the Board of Finance, and the mill rate, the estimated mill rate has been calculated by the finance officer of the town.
And based upon, and the other caveats within that would be, at that point, the two unknowns, one of which will be finalized by the action of the Board of Assessment Appeals, and the second one, which will not be known,
Right.
May 3rd, is the final number for senior tax relief. You know,
Right.
the point that I was trying to make is you're looking to balance a budget by $127,000. We were off last year by $200,000 on senior tax relief.
Right. No, it's a valid point. I just,
That all sorts itself out after the fact, and there's nothing we can do about that at this time.
Actually, we're off further on our snow removal budget. I mean, those things happen during the course of the year.
That's one of the risks.
The issue
right.
at all.
If I
What we're trying to do is get to next week, not
Yeah,
trying to get to next
and
year.
if I could, Paul, I don't remember in the past ever us not having a knowledge of the mill rate impact the night of the expense budget vote.
I don't
And
either.
whatever the calculations are that are done, they never change that between the Board of Finance meeting and the RTM meeting. And if the numbers change down the road because of reassessments or whatever, that's just life. That's what happened 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So it would seem to me, given that there's a net $125,000 change, the safest thing for you to do or for us to do, is to acknowledge, well, there should be reflected a 1/100th change in the mill rate, which is a $240,000 bump, which gives you wiggle room to then lower later if you can. But to do the short side would not be kind of,
Wise.
wise, exactly.
I don't think we would have done that in the past.
Right.
And we haven't done it in the past.
Mr. Kiley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hey, Mr. Hiller, is the collection rate, I'm taking a step back from the mill rate, trying to get to the collection rate difference that would need to happen to balance this budget that's before us, to close the $127,000 gap. So just follow my math and see if I'm at all close. Is the collection rate that's assumed in this book .9892? Is that?
Correct.
That's correct? Yes. Okay. That collection rate is what is applied, the current year levy line, 4,000, okay? That is the number that 98.92 was applied against. There was some number that number was applied against to come up with the 237K, or million, right? Correct? So if I take the 237,602,492 and I divide it by .9892, I come up with 240,196,615. So that's the number that multiplied by 9892 would get you back to this number.
You've got the other two elements, the other elements that you're missing in that calculation are you've got to start with the grand list. You've got to make an assumption
Yep,
as to what action is going to be taken
right.
by the Board of Assessment. Be negative. I mean, there's going to be some reduction. 5 years ago, that reduction was just under $20 million of grand list reduction.
Right.
We anticipate it to be less than that, but we haven't, as I say, Mr. Brown and I have had discussions on that. We think it's going to be something less than that.
Right.
As I say, the big thing that has happened in the last 60 days is the reduction that was brought in by, and signed off on February 28th by Mr. Brown to OPM was a larger reduction in the grand list, primarily as a result, no, not primarily, solely as a result of the informal hearings.
Okay.
But most of that was assumed in our calculation.
It's, I'm not.
Well,
Of course it was. Yes, we
Portion.
assumed 100, yeah,
The
most of
major
it.
portion, but not as large.
But most of it was already in here.
Most of it's in.
We had
most.
assumed a drop. It's already in here. It's a little worse, but it's not a, huge amount worse.
No, it's not.
Mr. Brockfeld, did you have something?
But I think what you're trying to get is just what's the 1/100th change?
It is, guys,
That's
yeah,
where I was
this
trying to
is-
go. It's not working.
But I don't understand,
Can you let Kevin, I think, is going somewhere good, if you can
Yeah.
but,
let him finish.
yeah, okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
All right, so
Sorry.
I understand all the things that happened before I get to this calculation, and I understand the reasons and the changes and all that stuff, and they're all valid, but when you get right down to it, it's mathematics. So that collection rate applied against 240 gets you to the 237 that's in this book, as ancient as this data may be. If you were to increase that collections rate by .0005, which is 5/1000s, excuse me, that would generate another $120,000 worth of taxation revenue. And that would take your collection rate from 98.92 to 98.97.
That was the number I was trying to get before.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I did it, because I heard you asking a question. So,
So you kind of have that choice, or you could bump the
right,
middle one 100.
right. So if you can assume $120,000, if my math is correct, and I'm on the fly here, if you want to assume another $120,000 of additional tax levy, your rate would go to 98.98% from the current 98, or no, 90, it would go to 98.9, or 9, one last time. It will go to 98.97 from
I got you, Mr. Tetra, on the
98.82,
first.
right?
Yep.
Anyway,
Mr. Brockfeld?
I guess, and I don't know if this is developing into a motion, but I guess that Mr. Kiley's, everything you said mathematically is true.
I think.
It most likely is, it sounds like it, but to me, it doesn't, it's not germane. I think that, as Mr. Hiller has pointed out, there's going to be a whole range of changes to these numbers, totally not within our control between now and when the budget is all signed off on and it finally comes back to us to set the mill rate. You mentioned senior tax relief changes to the grand list and so forth. Again, not to repeat myself, but I still can't understand why, unless this board is uncomfortable with the expense and the revenue numbers we've arrived at, and I'm not uncomfortable, I just don't know why we can't just approve those two numbers, either singly or together,
Right.
and send it to the fiscal officer, knowing full well that there's going to be some adjustments made. It may improve the situation, it may make the situation slightly worse, and it will probably affect the millage rate by some very, very small amount, and we're willing to accept that. And I just don't, we can't micromanage this to get to the number we want. It's not.
Mr. Brockfeld, I completely agree with your sentiments, and I think the only caveat I would have to that is that I just want to make sure when something is published in the paper under our auspices and our names.
Well, that circles back to what you said 10 minutes ago.
Exactly.
Right.
All I want is
Yeah.
it footnoted that the
Right.
mill rate is an estimate by the fiscal officer based on the approved revenues and expenses of the Board of Finance, and it is an estimate as of a date and time, period, where the revenue and expenses, at least from our perspective, are set amounts. Yes, Mr. Tetra.
I believe, as in the past, the wording for that newspaper ad is pretty standard. It talks about these are the expenses that are approved.
Yep.
These are the revenues that are projected or estimated.
Yep.
And it talks about, based on that, the anticipated mill rate estimated mill rate would be the following. So I think we're all okay on that. I think our instruction is that, and just to get this discussion to a close, I would move that we accept the revenue number and expenses number as done, and ask the chief fiscal officer to put in the projected mill rate that balances those off, so we send a balanced budget onto the RTM.
Okay, and our balanced budget, do we have a second for that motion? Yeah. We have a second by Mr. Bolito, I'm going to take, and the amount is, Mrs. Gardner?
Okay. 264,034,123.
264,034,123. That is the revenue and the expenses for this budget. We are in balance. Any questions, comments, concerns on this? Mr. Stone?
Just want to make sure, are we approving the whole budget now?
We are.
Okay.
Any motions, any questions, comments, concern? Seeing none, all in favor? All opposed? Abstentions. We have 8 in favor, 1 against, no abstentions. We are done with the operating budget. We are in balance. Mr. Hill, I would ask that we just get a copy of what language it's going to be in,
I will-
and it's
I
just,
will
I can't
present-
remember the mill rate language. That's,
Bring to the
And
board
Mr. Chair,
Tuesday night's
Yes.
meeting.
as has been suggested in the past, if the chief fiscal officer could review that ad with you before it goes in the papers, so as our representative, you're clear that it says what we've agreed to?
thank you. Is
What
everybody
I could
on the
offer
board?
is I will bring to the board on Tuesday evening
Thank you.
WPCA.
We are going to do the WPCA.
a
Thank you.
two-column sheet, one which shows the previous number, the derivation of the previous number, all of the calculations within that, and then a suggested new number, which would be the published number, as a result of the things that have happened in the last 60 days, essentially.
I agree. Thank you, Mr. Hill. I appreciate that, and I like Mr. Tetro's idea of a review of the ad. The last budget of the evening and the last budget of this budget cycle is Water Pollution Control Authority. The budget is on page 253 to 257. Any questions, comments, concerns, or motions on this budget? Seeing none, all in favor of this budget? Opposed, abstentions, this budget passes unanimously. That is the end of the budget process. Is our work here done? All right, work here is done. May we have a motion to adjourn? So moved. Seconded by Mr. DeWitt. All in favor? Opposed, abstentions? Thank you, everybody. Good night. Thanks for that. Good job.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, guys.